I work in a Russian military base. I just saw something I wish I didn't. Hey everyone. I've been a lurker here for a while, but I never thought I'd have something worth sharing until now. I work at a Russian military base in the middle of nowhere, Siberia to be exact. It's as cold and desolate as you'd imagine, and sometimes I think the isolation gets to everyone here. But what I saw last night, it's something else entirely. I need to get this out before I lose my mind. To give you a bit of background, I'm a technician, mostly dealing with maintenance of equipment and systems that support our operations. It's not glamorous, but it pays well, and frankly, there's not much else to do around here. We're surrounded by nothing but snow and ice for miles, with the nearest town being a 6-hour drive away. There's a small community within the base, and we all know each other pretty well. At least, I thought I did. Last night I was on the night shift, which is usually pretty uneventful. The base goes into a sort of hibernation mode, with minimal staff on duty to monitor systems and respond to any emergencies. It's usually just me and a couple of security guys, maybe a scientist or two if there's an experiment running. We rotate shifts so everyone gets their fair share of day and night shifts. It was around 2 a.m. when I noticed something odd. I was in the control room, checking the readouts from the various sensors and systems. Everything was normal until I saw a blip on the radar screen. It was a small, fast-moving object coming in from the northwest. At first, I thought it might be a glitch, but then it disappeared just as quickly as it appeared. I called the security team to see if they had noticed anything unusual, but they hadn't. They brushed it off as a sensor malfunction and told me to keep an eye on it. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. An hour later, I was doing a routine check of the base's external cameras when I saw it. There was a figure, barely visible against the snow, moving towards the base. At first, I thought it was one of our guys. Maybe someone got lost outside, but as it got closer, I realized it wasn't human. It moved in a way that was unnatural, jerky, and too fast. It was tall, with long limbs, and its skin was a sickly pale blue. I could barely make out its face, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It had no eyes, just empty sockets, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. I grabbed the radio and called the security team again, my voice shaking. "There's something outside. It's coming towards the base. It's not human." They must have heard the panic in my voice because they responded immediately, saying they were on their way. I kept watching the cameras, my heart pounding. The creature was getting closer, and I could see more details now. Its skin was covered in frost, and it left a trail of blood in the snow behind it. It looked like it was dragging something, but I couldn't tell what. Then, suddenly, the cameras went out. The screens turned to static, and I was left staring at nothing. I tried to reboot the system, but it was no use. The cameras were offline, and I had no way of knowing where the creature was. The security team burst into the control room, weapons ready. I explained what I saw, and they looked at me like I was crazy. But they couldn't ignore the fact that the cameras were down, and something had triggered the alarms. We headed to the main entrance, where the creature was last seen. The snow outside was undisturbed, no sign of anything unusual. But then we saw the trail of blood, leading towards one of the storage buildings. The security team moved in formation, guns raised, as we followed the trail. The storage building was dark and cold. The only sound was our footsteps crunching on the snow. We found the source of the blood trail quickly enough. It was one of the scientists, or what was left of him. His body was torn apart, limbs scattered, and his face frozen in a mask of terror. There was no sign of the creature, but the blood was fresh. It had to be close. We searched the building, but it was empty. No sign of the creature. No sign of how it got in or out. The security team was on high alert, and we locked down the base. But there was nothing else to be found. I spent the rest of my shift in a state of shock, replaying the events over and over in my head. What was that thing? How did it get so close to the base without being detected? And why did it kill the scientist? I don't know if I'll ever get answers to these questions, but I had to share this. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar, or maybe I'm just going crazy. All I know is that I'm terrified of what might happen next. If you've read this far, thank you. I'll keep you updated if anything else happens. Stay safe out there. Hey everyone, thanks for the support and suggestions. I've been trying to process what happened, but things have only gotten stranger since my last post. Here's what's been going on since that night. After the incident, the higher-ups at the base went into full lockdown mode. They brought in additional security and even called in a couple of higher-ranking officers to investigate. We were all interrogated separately about what we saw and did that night. They were especially interested in my account, since I was the one who saw the creature on the cameras. They combed through the base with a fine-tooth comb, but found nothing. No sign of the creature, no additional blood trails, and no evidence of how it got in or out. The official explanation was that it was some kind of animal attack, but none of us believed that. Whatever it wasn't an animal. About a week after the attack, things started to calm down a bit. The additional security was still there, but the tension had lessened. That's when I started having the dreams. They're always the same. I'm standing outside the base, in the snow, and I can see the creature in the distance, moving towards me. I try to run, but my legs won't move. I wake up just as it reaches me, its empty eye sockets staring into mine. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me until I heard others were having the same dream. One of the security guys, Ivan, mentioned it in passing one night. We were on shift together, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. I asked him what was going on, and he described the exact same dream. He looked at me with haunted eyes and said, "It's like it's calling to us." Things took another turn for the worse, when people started disappearing. It started with one of the janitors. He didn't show up for his shift, and no one could find him. Then one of the scientists vanished. No one saw or heard anything. They were just gone. The base is locked down tight, so there's no way they could have left without being noticed. I began to notice other strange things around the base. Shadows that seemed to move on their own. Strange noises in the middle of the night. And a feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake. I started carrying a knife with me at all times. Even when I was just doing routine checks, I wasn't taking any chances. One night, about 2 weeks after the initial incident, I was on shift alone in the control room. It was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I was staring at the radar screen, half expecting to see another blip when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from one of the vents. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the wind or a rat, but it got louder. I grabbed my knife and went to investigate. The sound was coming from the vent near the floor. I crouched down and shone my flashlight inside, but I couldn't see anything. Then, out of nowhere, a hand shot out of the vent, grabbing my wrist. I screamed and yanked my arm back, but the grip was like iron. The hand was pale and cold, just like the creature I'd seen. I slashed at it with my knife, and it let go, retreating back into the darkness of the vent. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The vent cover had been torn off, and there were deep scratches in the metal. I radioed the security team, my voice shaking, and they came running. We searched the vents, but there was no sign of the hand or the creature it belonged to. The higher-ups dismissed it as a hallucination, a result of stress and lack of sleep. But I know what I saw. That thing, whatever it is still out there, and it's getting bolder. I don't know how much more of this I can take. I've been trying to get transferred to another base, but my requests keep getting denied. It's like they want us to stay here, like they're studying us as much as they're studying the creature. I've started keeping a journal of everything that happens, just in case. If I disappear, I want someone to know the truth. There's something in the ice out here, something ancient and evil, and I think it's only just beginning to wake up. Thanks for reading. I'll update you if anything else happens. Stay safe. Hey everyone, I'm back with another update. Things have gotten even worse since my last post. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality. After the incident with the hand in the vent, the higher-ups brought in a team of specialists. They didn't tell us much about them, but they're clearly not regular military. They set up a command center in one of the unused buildings and have been conducting all sorts of tests and experiments. We're not allowed to go near the place, but but I've overheard some of the guards talking. Whatever they're doing, it's not normal. People are still disappearing. Another scientist vanished 2 days ago. Her name was Dr. Kirova, and she was one of the few people I actually got along with here. We were talking just the night before she went missing. She told me she'd been having the same dreams as the rest of us, and she looked terrified. She said she felt like something was watching her, even when she was alone. I tried to reassure her, but I don't think I was very convincing. The next morning, she didn't show up for breakfast. Her room was empty, and there were no signs of a struggle. It's like she just vanished into thin air. The security team did a full sweep of the base and the surrounding area, but there was no trace of her. The higher-ups told us to stay calm and stick to our routines, but it's hard to stay calm when people keep disappearing. Last night, something happened that I still can't fully process. I was on shift in the control room again, trying to stay focused and not think about the nightmares. I was checking the cameras when I saw movement outside. At first, I thought it was just one of the guards making their rounds, but then I got a closer look. It was Dr. Kirova. She was stumbling through the snow, barefoot and wearing only a thin nightgown. Her skin was pale, and she looked like she was in a trance. I called out to her through the intercom, but she didn't respond. She just kept walking towards the edge of the base, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. I grabbed my coat and ran outside, calling for backup on the radio. The cold hit me like a punch to the gut, but I kept going, following her footprints in the snow. When I finally caught up to her, she was standing at the edge of a frozen lake, staring into the darkness. "Dr. Kirova!" I shouted, but she didn't turn around. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and that's when she spoke. Her voice was flat and monotone, like she was in a trance. "They're calling to me," she said. "They're waiting." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who's waiting? What are you talking about?" She turned to look at me, and I saw that her eyes were completely white, like she was blind. "The ones who came before. They're trapped, and they need us to free them." Before I could react, she stepped onto the ice. I tried to grab her, but she was too fast. The ice cracked beneath her feet, and she disappeared into the freezing water. I watched in horror as she was pulled under, her face contorted in a silent scream. The backup arrived a few minutes later, but it was too late. We searched the lake, but there was no sign of her body. It's like she was swallowed by the ice. I don't know what to do anymore. The dreams are getting worse, and I feel like I'm being watched all the time. The specialists are still here, and I think they know more than they're letting on. They've been asking us more questions, and they seem especially interested in our dreams. I've been talking to Ivan and a few of the other guys, and we're all on edge. We've started making plans to leave the base, even if it means deserting. It's not safe here, and I don't think it ever was. I'll keep you updated as best I can, but if I go silent, you'll know why. There's something out here, something ancient and evil, and I don't think we're going to survive much longer. Thanks for reading. Stay safe, and if you're ever in Siberia, stay far away from this place. Hey everyone, things have gone from bad to worse. I'm not even sure how to start this, but I feel like I'm running out of time. If you're reading this, please understand that this isn't some elaborate story. This is real, and I'm scared out of my mind. After Dr. Kirova's disappearance, the specialists increased their activities. They brought in more equipment, and the sounds of their machines echoed through the base day and night. They started to restrict our movements, saying it was for our own safety. We weren't allowed to leave our quarters unless on duty, and even then, we had to check in and out with security. The dreams have been getting worse for all of us. They're more vivid now, more intense. It's like the creature is getting closer each time, and we can't escape. I've started waking up with scratches on my arms and legs, and I know I'm not doing it to myself. Ivan and I decided we couldn't wait any longer. We needed to get out before we ended up like the others. We made a plan to leave during the night, when security was at its lightest. There's an old supply route that's been out of use for years, but we figured it was our best shot. We gathered what supplies we could without raising suspicion and waited for our chance. That night, as we were preparing to leave, something happened that made us rethink everything. One of the other guys, Sergei, started screaming in his sleep. We rushed to his room and found him thrashing on his bed, covered in sweat. When we finally woke him up, he was hysterical, babbling about the creature and how it was inside the base. He kept repeating, "It's here, it's here," over and over again. We tried to calm him down, but nothing worked. That's when we heard the alarms. The base went into full lockdown, and the lights flickered before going out completely. We were plunged into darkness with only the emergency lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. We grabbed our flashlights and weapons and headed towards the control room, figuring it was the safest place to be. As we made our way through the corridors, we heard strange noises all around us, scratching like something was moving through the vents, and whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When we reached the control room, we found it empty. The screens were dead, and the place was in disarray. Papers and equipment were scattered all over the floor, and there was a foul smell in the air, like something had died. We barricaded the door and tried to figure out what to do next. That's when we saw it, the creature, on one of the few functioning monitors. It was inside the base, moving through the halls with that unnatural jerky motion. It looked directly at the camera, as if it knew we were watching. Its empty eye sockets seemed to pierce through the screen, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. We watched in horror as it moved closer to our location. It stopped in front of the control room door, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a deafening crash, it slammed against the door. We could hear the metal groaning under the impact, and the door began to buckle. In a panic, we tried to find another way out, but the vents were too small, and there were no other exits. The creature kept pounding on the door, and I could see the fear in Ivan's eyes. We were trapped. Just when I thought the door would give way, the pounding stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. We waited, barely daring to breathe, until we heard a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, all around us. Suddenly, the door flew open, and the specialists stormed in, armed to the teeth. They were followed by a group of soldiers in hazmat suits, carrying what looked like high-tech weapons. They quickly secured the room and motioned for us to follow them. We didn't hesitate. They led us to their command center, where they'd set up a series of barriers and checkpoints. It was clear they'd been preparing for something like this. The lead specialist, a man named Dr. Morozov, briefed us quickly. He told us they'd been studying the creature for years, and it was some kind of ancient entity, awakened by the melting ice. He said they had a plan to contain it, but they needed our help. They couldn't risk losing more of their own people, and we knew the base better than anyone. We didn't have much choice, so we agreed. The plan was simple but dangerous. We had to lure the creature into a containment chamber they'd set up in the old supply route. They'd rigged the chamber with a series of traps and high-voltage electrified walls, designed to incapacitate it long enough for them to seal it inside. We split into two teams. One would act as bait, drawing the creature towards the chamber, while the other would be ready to activate the traps. I was on the bait team with Ivan and a couple of soldiers. We moved quickly and quietly through the darkened base, following the path we'd seen the creature take on the monitors. The air was thick with tension, and every noise made us jump. As we got closer to the chamber, we heard the scratching again, louder this time. The creature appeared in front of us, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made real. Its twisted grin seemed even more grotesque up close, and the sight of it sent a wave of fear through me. We backed away slowly, trying to lead it towards the chamber. It followed us, its movements jerky and unnatural. When we reached the entrance to the chamber, Ivan signaled the other team. They activated the traps, and the chamber lit up with a blinding flash of light. The creature shrieked, a sound that echoed through the base and sent shivers down my spine. It thrashed against the electrified walls, but they held firm. The soldiers quickly moved in, sealing the chamber with heavy metal doors. The shrieking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Dr. Morozov approached us, his face grim. "It's contained for now," he said, "but we don't know how long it will hold." We returned to the main part of the base, exhausted but relieved. The immediate danger was over, but I knew it wasn't the end. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't going to stay contained forever, and the dreams, The disappearances, the sense of being watched, it all pointed to something bigger, something we still didn't understand. I'm writing this from my quarters, and I can hear the sounds of the specialists working, preparing for whatever comes next. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'll keep you all updated as best I can. If you're reading this, thank you for listening. Stay safe and pray that we can keep this nightmare contained. Hey everyone, this might be my last update. Things have spiraled out of control, and I don't know if we're going to make it. I'm scared, and I don't see a way out. Here's what's been happening since we contained the creature. After we trapped the creature, the specialists kept a close watch on the containment chamber. They set up cameras and sensors to monitor it 24/7. At first, everything seemed stable. The creature was trapped, and the base returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the dreams didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. I started seeing more than just the creature. I saw visions of ancient ruins buried under the ice, of strange symbols and rituals, and of people from the base being dragged into the darkness. I wasn't the only one. Everyone who had seen the creature had similar dreams, and it was taking a toll on us. Ivan, especially, was struggling. He barely slept, and when he did, he woke up screaming. One night, about a week after the containment, the alarms went off again. This time, it wasn't the creature breaking out. It was something else, something bigger. The entire base shook, and the lights flickered before going out completely. We were plunged into darkness, with only the emergency lights casting an eerie red glow. Dr. Morozov and his team were scrambling to figure out what was happening. They checked the monitors, but the cameras were down. All we could see were static and occasional glimpses of something moving in the shadows. The specialists geared up, ready to face whatever was coming, but I could see the fear in their eyes. Then we heard it, a low, rumbling sound, like the growl of a massive beast. It echoed through the base, making the walls vibrate. The sound was coming from beneath us, from the ice. The ground started to crack, and I felt a cold wind blowing up from the fissures. Dr. Morozov gathered us all in the command center and explained what he thought was happening. He believed the creature we trapped was just a harbinger, a scout for something much older and more powerful, something that had been buried under the ice for millennia. He said the melting ice had awakened it, and now it was coming for us. The plan was simple: evacuate the base and get as far away as possible. The specialists had called for backup, but it would take hours for help to arrive, and we didn't have that kind of time. We grabbed what we could and headed for the vehicles, hoping to make it out before whatever was coming reached us. As we made our way through the base, the ground continued to shake. The fissures in the ice were getting wider, and I could see something moving in the darkness below. It was like the ice was alive, shifting and cracking as it prepared to swallow us. We reached the garage, but our escape was blocked. The doors were frozen shut, and the vehicles were covered in a thick layer of frost. We tried to break through, but it was no use. We were trapped. That's when the creature appeared again, emerging from one of the fissures. It was bigger now, more grotesque. Its skin was covered in frost, and its empty eye sockets glowed with an eerie blue light. It moved towards us, its jerky movements more fluid and menacing. The specialists opened fire, but their bullets seemed to have little effect. The creature kept coming, and I knew we were running out of options. Dr. Morozov shouted for us to retreat to the control room, where we could try to make a last stand. We ran, the creature close behind us. The base was falling apart around us, the walls cracking and the floor shifting beneath our feet. We made it to the control room and barricaded the door, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Dr. Morozov was working frantically at the controls, trying to activate some kind of emergency protocol. He said there was a way to collapse the base and seal whatever was beneath the ice, but it was risky. It could bury us alive, but it was the only chance we had. The creature started pounding on the door, and I could see the metal beginning to bend. We didn't have much time. Dr. Morozov looked at me and Ivan, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. "We have to do this," he said. "It's our only hope." We all agreed, and Dr. Morozov activated the protocol. The ground shook violently, and I heard the sound of explosions as charges went off deep within the base. The creature screeched, A sound that pierced my ears and made my blood run cold. The control room began to collapse around us, the ceiling caving in and the walls crumbling. We huddled together, praying that the plan would work and that we wouldn't be buried alive. As the dust settled, I realized we were still alive. The creature's screeches had stopped and the shaking had subsided. We had done it. We had sealed whatever was beneath the ice, at least for now, but we were trapped. The control room was intact, but the exits were blocked by rubble. We had no way out, and our supplies were limited. I don't know how long we can survive down here, but at least the nightmares have stopped. If you're reading this, please know that we tried our best. There's something out here, something ancient and evil, and it's only a matter of time before it awakens again. Stay safe and stay away from Siberia. Thank you for listening. This is probably my last update. I hope someone out there can learn from our mistakes and prevent this from happening again. Goodbye and good luck. Every man in my family disappears at age 18. I turn 18 in 3 hours. All right, here goes. I've never posted anything like this before, and honestly, I don't even know where to start. I guess I should give you some background info first. My name is Alex, and I'm about to turn 18. That might sound like a pretty ordinary statement, but in my family, it's not. You see, every man in my family has disappeared on their 18th birthday. It's a fact, and I turn 18 in 3 hours. Growing up, I always heard the stories. My dad vanished on his 18th birthday, and my granddad did too. Hell, every male ancestor I know of has vanished into thin air at 18. My mum tried to shield me from it, pretending like it wasn't a big deal, but I could see the fear in her eyes as my birthday approached. It all started when I was a kid. My mum always kept me close, not letting me go on sleepovers or trips without her. I thought she was just overprotective, but as I got older, she started telling me about the curse. She didn't call it that, but it was clear enough. Every year, she'd show me a photo album filled with pictures of the men in our family, all smiling and carefree until their 18th birthday. Then, nothing, just blank pages. I didn't believe her at first. It sounded like some creepy ghost story, but then I started asking questions. I asked my uncles, my cousins, anyone who would listen. They all had the same story. Their dad, brother, uncle, or cousin had disappeared at 18. No bodies, no notes, no trace. So here I am, counting down the hours until my 18th birthday, scared out of my mind. I've been trying to prepare myself, trying to figure out what to do. But how do you prepare for something like this? I've barricaded myself in my room with food, water, and anything I might need. I even set up a camera to record everything, just in case. 3 hours to go. My mum is downstairs, probably crying. She's tried to stay strong, but I can see it's tearing her apart. She keeps saying she's sorry, that she wished she could do something, but it's not her fault. This is something beyond her control, beyond anyone's control. I'm writing this because I need to do something, anything, to keep my mind off the ticking clock. I keep glancing at the time, watching the seconds slip away. I can't help but think about my dad. I don't remember much about him, just that he was a good man. My mum says he was the best, always smiling and full of life. Then, on his 18th birthday, he vanished. It's strange, knowing that in a few hours I might just disappear. What happens when I do? Do I die? Do I get transported somewhere? Is there some kind of monster waiting for me? I've spent countless nights thinking about it, trying to come up with theories, but nothing makes sense. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. I keep thinking about the last conversation I had with my grandpa. He was the only one who talked about the curse openly. I remember him sitting me down and telling me, "Alex, there's something you need to know about our family. The men, we're cursed. On your 18th birthday, something will happen. I don't know what, but you need to be prepared. Don't be afraid, and whatever you do, don't run. Those words have haunted me ever since. Oh, don't be afraid. How can I not be afraid? Every time I close my eyes, I see darkness, like a void waiting to swallow me whole. I've tried to be brave, but the fear is overwhelming. I've been looking through old family journals, trying to find any clues or patterns. Most of them are filled with mundane stuff, but a few entries stand out. My great-great-grandfather wrote about strange dreams he had leading up to his 18th birthday. Dreams of shadows and whispers. My great-uncle mentioned seeing a man in his dreams. A man with no face who told him he was coming for him. It's all so surreal, like something out of a horror movie. I keep hoping I'll wake up and this will all be a bad dream. But I know it's real. The fear in my mum's eyes, the silence in our house, it's all too real. 2 hours and 45 minutes. The clock is mocking me now, each second louder than the last. I can hear my mum moving around downstairs, probably trying to keep herself busy. She's always been strong, but this is breaking her. I want to go down and hug her, tell her everything will be okay, but I can't bring myself to move. It's like I'm frozen, paralyzed by fear. I've been thinking about writing letters to my friends, telling them goodbye. But what would I say? Hey, I'm about to disappear because of some family curse. See you never. They wouldn't believe me. They'd think it's a joke or that I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. I tried calling the police once, thinking maybe they could help. But what would I say? Help! I'm about to vanish because of a family curse. They'd probably lock me up in a mental hospital. No, this is something I have to face alone. I've considered running away, just taking off and hiding somewhere. But I know it wouldn't work. Wherever I go, the curse will follow. It's not about where I am, it's about who I am. I'm part of this family, and there's no escaping that. 2 hours and 30 minutes. The air in my room feels thick, like I'm suffocating. I keep pacing, trying to keep my mind occupied. I've gone over every possibility, every scenario, but nothing makes sense. It's like I'm trapped in a nightmare with no way out. I don't know what's going to happen in the next few hours, but I'm going to keep writing. If I disappear, maybe someone will find this and know what happened. Maybe they can figure out a way to break the curse. 2 hours and 15 minutes. My hands are shaking so much it's hard to type. I can hear strange noises now, like whispers just out of earshot. I'm trying to stay calm, but the fear is overwhelming. I keep telling myself to be brave, to not be afraid, but it's getting harder. 2 hours. The whispers are getting louder. I can't make out what they're saying, but it's like they're calling my name. I feel like I'm being watched, like there's something in the room with me. I keep looking over my shoulder, but there's nothing there. I know I should probably get out of here, but where would I go? 1 hour and 45 minutes. I can barely breathe. The whispers are constant now, a steady hum in the background. I'm trying to hold it together, but I'm losing it. I keep thinking about my dad, about my grandpa. Did they feel like this too? Were they as scared as I am? 1 hour and 30 minutes. The room feels colder, like there's a draft coming from somewhere. I can see my breath now, little puffs of white in the dim light. The whispers are louder, almost a chant. I can't make out the words, but it's like they're inside my head. 1 hour and 15 minutes. The camera is still recording, but I don't know if it will catch anything. I keep looking at it, hoping it'll capture whatever happens. If I disappear, maybe someone will see it and know I wasn't crazy. 1 hour. The whispers have stopped. The room is silent, but it's a heavy silence, like the calm before a storm. I'm shaking so much I can barely type. I keep thinking about my mum, about how she's going to handle this. I hope she'll be okay. 45 minutes. I can hear footsteps now, soft and steady, like someone is pacing outside my door. I'm trying to stay calm, but my heart is racing. I keep glancing at the door, waiting for it to burst open. 30 minutes. The footsteps have stopped, but the silence is even worse. It's like the whole house is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I keep telling myself to be brave, to not be afraid, but it's getting harder. 15 minutes. I can hear my mum crying downstairs. I want to go to her, to tell her it'll be okay, but I can't move. I'm frozen with fear, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. 5 minutes. The room is getting darker. like the shadows are closing in. I can barely see the screen now. The whispers are back, louder than ever, a chorus of voices calling my name. 1 minute, this is it. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm ready. I've done everything I can. If I disappear, I hope someone finds this. I hope someone can break the curse. Midnight. The room is pitch black now. I can feel something, a presence, like someone is standing right behind me. I'm too scared to turn around. I'm shaking so much I can barely type. This is it. I can feel it. And then, nothing. The whispers stop. The room is silent. I'm still here. Did it work? Did I survive? I don't know what to think. I'm still shaking, still scared, but I'm here. I'm still here. The relief that washed over me at midnight was fleeting. I sat there in the darkness, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Minutes ticked by, and I was still there, in my room, alive and whole. I started to think maybe it was all a cruel joke, a twisted family legend designed to scare the shit out of me. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked over to the door. I paused, listening for any sound from the hallway. Nothing. Slowly, I opened the door and peeked out. The house was quiet, eerily so. The only sound was my mum's muffled crying downstairs. I stepped into the hallway, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, like I'd done this before in a dream. I made my way downstairs, each step creaking under my weight. My mum was in the living room, hunched over on the couch, her face buried in her hands. I hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat next to her. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Mum, I'm still here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Alex, oh my God, you're still here. I thought you were gone." She pulled me into a tight hug, sobbing into my shoulder. I held her, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. Why hadn't I disappeared like the others? We sat there for a long time, just holding each other. Eventually she pulled away, wiping her tears. "I don't understand. This has never happened before. Every man in our family, they all disappeared. Why are you still here?" "I don't know, Mum. Maybe it's over. Maybe the curse is broken," I said, trying to reassure her. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Something didn't feel right. We stayed up the rest of the night, talking and trying to make sense of it all. As the sun started to rise, I felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe it really was over. Maybe I was the first to break the curse. But as the day went on, that sense of calm started to fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I kept hearing those whispers in the back of my mind, faint but persistent. I tried to ignore them, to focus on the fact that I was still alive, but it was like they were burrowing into my brain. That evening, I decided to go through the family journals again, looking for any clues I might have missed. I spent hours reading through them, page after page of mundane entries, mixed with the occasional strange dream or unexplained event. It wasn't until I found my great-grandfather's journal that things started to make sense. He'd written about his 18th birthday in detail, describing the same fear and anxiety I'd felt. But unlike the others, he'd left a note before he disappeared. It was a single, cryptic sentence. "The darkness comes for those who seek the light." I had no idea what it meant, but it sent a chill down my spine. I read through the rest of his journal, hoping for more clues, but that was it. Just that one sentence. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what it meant. I barely slept, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. I felt like I was losing my mind. My mum tried to get me to see a doctor, but I refused. I knew this wasn't something a doctor could fix. One night, I decided to go back to my grandpa's house. It had been abandoned for years, ever since he disappeared. I don't know what I was hoping to find, but I felt like I needed to go there. Maybe being in his house would help me understand what was happening. I drove out there late at night, the moon casting an eerie glow over the old house. It looked just as I remembered, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. I parked my car, and walked up to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. I made my way through the darkened rooms, memories flooding back with each step. I found my way to my grandpa's study, the place where he'd spent most of his time. The room was just as he'd left it, books and papers strewn across the desk. I started going through them, looking for anything that might help me understand the curse. Most of it was nonsense, old letters and bills, but then I found a small, leather-bound book. It was my grandpa's journal, one I'd never seen before. I opened it, my hands trembling. The first few pages were filled with the same mundane details as the others, but then I found an entry that made my blood run cold. June 5th, 1987. The whispers are getting louder. I can hear them even when I'm awake now. They tell me the darkness is coming, that I need to be ready. I don't know what they mean, but I'm scared. I don't want to disappear like the others. I kept reading, my heart pounding in my chest. The entries grew more frantic, more desperate. He wrote about seeing shadows moving in the corners of his vision, about feeling like he was being watched. His last entry was a single, chilling sentence. The darkness is here. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. The darkness. That's what the whispers had been talking about. I realized then that it wasn't over. The curse wasn't broken. I'd only delayed the inevitable. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. What did it mean? How could I stop it? I spent the next few days researching everything I could about curses and family legends, but I found nothing that could help. The whispers were constant now, a steady hum in the back of my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I felt like I was being consumed by the darkness. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They were inside my head, growing louder and more insistent. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was worse, a heavy, oppressive silence that filled the room. I opened my eyes and saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a man, tall and shadowy, with no face, just like in the journals. He reached out a hand, and I felt a cold chill wash over me. I tried to move, to scream, but I was frozen. The darkness was all around me, closing in. "Alex," he said, his voice a whisper that echoed in my mind. "The darkness comes for those who seek the light." I don't know what happened next. Everything went black, and I felt like I was falling into an endless void. When I woke up, I was back in my room, but something was different. The whispers were gone, but the darkness was still there, lurking just out of sight. I don't know what's happening to me, but I know one thing. The curse isn't over. The darkness is still coming, and I don't know how to stop it. All I can do is keep fighting, keep searching for answers. And if I disappear, at least someone will know what happened. At least someone will know the truth. After that night, things took a turn for the worse. The whispers had stopped, but the presence of the darkness was stronger than ever. It felt like a shadow hanging over me, following me everywhere I went. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. My mum tried to keep things normal, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't understand it. I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the figure in my room, about the darkness that seemed to be closing in on me. She'd been through enough already. I spent my days going through old family records, searching for any clue that might help me understand the curse. It felt like I was running out of time, like the darkness was closing in faster with each passing day. The entries in my grandpa's journal haunted me, his desperate words echoing in my mind. Then, one night, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in the back of an old family Bible, I discovered a letter written by my great-great-grandfather. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting shaky and barely legible. March 12th, 1887. To whoever finds this, know that the curse is real. I have seen the darkness, felt its cold embrace. It is a force beyond our understanding, a shadow that seeks to consume us. We are cursed because of our bloodline, because of a pact made long ago. I do not know how to break it, but I pray that one day someone will find a way. I sat there, staring at the letter, my mind racing. A pact? Who would make a pact like that, and why? I had so many questions, but no answers. The more I learned, the more hopeless it seemed. That night, the darkness felt heavier than ever. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whispers to return. But they didn't. Instead, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. I got up and crept to my bedroom door, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were coming from the hallway, getting closer. I could feel the darkness, a cold, oppressive presence that made my skin crawl. I opened the door a crack and peeked out. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through a window. The footsteps stopped and I held my breath, straining to see anything in the shadows. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, tall and shadowy, just like the one in my room. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine, my heart racing with fear. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, its presence filling the hallway with darkness. I felt a cold breeze like the air was being sucked out of the room. I wanted to run, to hide, but I was frozen in place. Then the figure started to move, slowly advancing down the hallway. I backed into my room, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness was all around me, closing in. Just as the figure reached my door, it stopped. I could feel its gaze. Even though it had no face, it raised a hand, and I felt a cold chill wash over me. "Alex," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. "The darkness is coming." I slammed the door and backed away, my heart pounding. The room felt colder, the darkness thicker. I could hear the figure outside the door, its presence a suffocating weight. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on my bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The figure never entered, and as the first light of dawn crept through the window, the oppressive feeling of the darkness began to fade. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the house. The darkness was getting stronger, and I couldn't fight it alone. I needed answers, and I needed help. But who could I turn to? Who would believe me? I decided to visit the old town library. It was a long shot, but maybe there was something there that could help me understand the curse. Maybe there was a record of the pact my great-great-grandfather had mentioned. The library was old and dusty, filled with the musty smell of aging books. I spent hours combing through old records, searching for anything that might give me a clue. It was slow going, and I was starting to lose hope when I found an old newspaper article that made my heart skip a beat. "Local man makes mysterious pact," the headline read. The article was dated March 10th, 1877, and it told the story of my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Reed, making a deal with a stranger in exchange for wealth and power. The details were vague, but it mentioned a dark figure and a warning that the pact would have consequences for future generations. I sat there, staring at the article, feeling a mix of anger and despair. My ancestor had cursed our family for his own gain, and now we were paying the price. But knowing the origin of the curse didn't help me break it. I needed to find a way to end it once and for all. I spent the next few days searching for more information about the pact and the stranger my great-great-grandfather had dealt with. I found references to dark rituals and shadowy figures in old folklore, but nothing concrete. The darkness was getting stronger. I could feel it, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. The whispers had returned, a constant hum in the back of my mind. I was running out of time. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They were inside my head, growing louder and more insistent. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was worse, a heavy, oppressive silence that filled the room. I opened my eyes and saw the figure standing at the foot of my bed again. This time, it was closer, its presence more tangible. "Alex," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. "The darkness is here. You cannot escape it." I felt a cold chill wash over me, my body frozen with fear. The darkness was all around me, suffocating me. I could feel it closing in, a cold, unrelenting force. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling, "tell me how to stop it." The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, watching me with its empty gaze. Then, it raised a hand, and I felt a surge of cold, like ice flowing through my veins. "You cannot stop it," the figure whispered. "The darkness is part of you. It is your destiny." I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. The darkness was inside me, consuming me. I could feel it, a cold, empty void that threatened to swallow me whole. And then, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of my bedroom, drenched in sweat and shivering uncontrollably. The figure was gone, but its words echoed in my mind. "The darkness is part of you. It is your destiny." I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. If the darkness was part of me, how could I ever escape it? I spent the next few days in a haze, barely eating or sleeping. I felt like a zombie, going through the motions of daily life, while the darkness lingered at the edges of my vision. My mum noticed the change in me and tried to help, but there was nothing she could do. I was trapped in my own personal nightmare. Desperation drove me back to the old journals. I scoured them for anything I might have missed, any clue that could help me understand what was happening. That's when I found an entry in my great-grandfather's journal that I hadn't noticed before. It was buried at the back, written in a shaky hand. September 3rd, 1923. I have seen the darkness and felt its cold embrace. It is a force beyond our understanding, but there is a way to fight it. The light can repel the darkness, but it requires a sacrifice. Only through giving up something precious can the darkness be held at bay. I read the entry over and over, trying to make sense of it. The light can repel the darkness. What did that mean? And what kind of sacrifice was he talking about? I didn't have any answers, but it was the first glimmer of hope I'd had in weeks. If there was a way to fight the darkness, I had to find it. I decided to visit the old family cemetery. It was a creepy, overgrown place that I'd avoided most of my life, but I felt like I needed to go there. Maybe being among the graves of my ancestors would help me understand what I needed to do. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. I walked among the tombstones, feeling a strange connection to the men who had come before me. Their lives had been cut short by the same curse that now threatened me. I found my great-grandfather's grave and knelt beside it, my heart heavy with sorrow. I placed a hand on the cold stone and closed my eyes, trying to feel some connection to him. I needed guidance, a sign, anything to help me understand how to fight the darkness. As I knelt there, I felt a strange warmth wash over me. It was like a ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds. I opened my eyes and saw a faint, glowing light emanating from the ground around the grave. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed the light, I felt a surge of energy. The light grew brighter, and I could see it forming into a shape, a figure made of pure light. It was my great-grandfather, his face serene and full of wisdom. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to see into my very soul. "Alex," he said, his voice soft and comforting. "The darkness is powerful, but it can be repelled. You must find the light within yourself. It requires a sacrifice, a willingness to give up something precious to you. Only then can you hold the darkness at bay." Tears streamed down my face as I listened to his words. I didn't understand what he meant, but I felt a sense of hope. If he believed I could fight the darkness, then maybe I could. I just needed to figure out what he meant by a sacrifice. The light began to fade, and my great-grandfather's figure dissolved into the air. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I felt a renewed sense of determination, I wasn't going to let the darkness consume me without a fight. I spent the next few days thinking about what my great-grandfather had said. The idea of a sacrifice weighed heavily on my mind. What could I give up that would be enough to repel the darkness? I thought about my family, my friends, everything that mattered to me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized there was only one thing I could offer: myself. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had to give up my own life to protect the ones I loved. It was the only way to break the curse, to end the darkness once and for all. The thought terrified me, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I spent my last days with my mum, trying to make the most of every moment. I didn't tell her what I was planning. I couldn't bear to see the pain in her eyes. Instead, I focused on making her smile, giving her as much love and happiness as I could. The night I planned to make the sacrifice, I wrote a letter explaining everything. I told my mum how much I loved her, how grateful I was for everything she'd done for me. I asked her to be strong, to remember that my sacrifice was for the greater good. I hoped she would understand. I drove back to the family cemetery, the letter tucked in my pocket. The night was dark and cold, the air filled with an eerie silence. I knelt beside my great-grandfather's grave, feeling a strange sense of peace. I was ready. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, focusing on the light within me. I thought about all the love and happiness I'd experienced in my life, the moments that had shaped me. I could feel the light growing stronger, pushing back against the darkness. Then, with a heavy heart, I whispered, "I'm ready." The darkness surged around me, cold and relentless. I felt it pulling at me, trying to drag me into its void, but the light within me held firm, pushing back against the shadows. I could feel the sacrifice taking hold, my life force draining away as the light grew brighter. As the darkness closed in, I saw the figure again, standing at the edge of the cemetery. But this time, it wasn't a shadow. It was my great-grandfather, his face filled with pride and sorrow. "Thank you, Alex," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "You have broken the curse. The darkness will no longer plague our family." I felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting off my shoulders. The light grew brighter, enveloping me in its warmth. I knew I was leaving this world, but I felt at peace. I had done what needed to be done. As the light consumed me, I thought about my mum, hoping she would find the letter and understand. I hoped she would find comfort in knowing that the curse was broken, that I had found a way to protect our family. And then, everything went white. When I opened my eyes, I found myself standing in a vast white expanse. There was no ground, no sky, just endless light in every direction. I felt weightless, like I was floating in a dream. For the first time in weeks, the oppressive presence of the darkness was gone. I felt a sense of peace, a warmth that filled me from within. "Alex," a familiar voice called out. I turned to see my great-grandfather standing before me, his face serene and full of wisdom. Beside him were the other men from my family, all the way back to my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Reed. They looked at me with expressions of gratitude and relief. "You did it," my great-grandfather said, his voice full of pride. "You broke the curse." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at the men who had come before me, their lives cut short by the darkness. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said, my voice trembling. "Thank you for guiding me." Thomas Reed stepped forward, his face lined with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Alex. It was my greed that brought this curse upon our family. I made a pact with a dark force, thinking it would bring us wealth and power, but it only brought suffering. You have freed us all from that burden." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I forgive you," I said softly. "We all make mistakes. What's important is that we find a way to make things right." The men around me nodded in agreement, their faces full of relief and gratitude. I felt a warmth spreading through me, a sense of connection to my ancestors that I had never felt before. We were bound by more than just blood. We were bound by a shared struggle, a fight against the darkness that had haunted our family for generations. As I stood there, surrounded by the men who had come before me, I felt a sense of closure. The curse was broken, the darkness banished. I knew that my family would no longer be plagued by the fear of disappearing at 18. We were free. "What's next?" I asked, looking around at the endless white expanse. My great-grandfather smiled. "That is up to you. This place is a transition, a space between worlds. You can choose to move on to whatever comes next, or you can stay here for a while, with us." I thought about my mum, about the letter I had left for her. I hoped she would find it and understand what had happened. I hoped she would find peace in knowing that the curse was broken, that I had found a way to protect our family. "I think I need to move on," I said, feeling a sense of resolution. "But I want to thank you all for your guidance and support. I couldn't have done it without you." The men nodded, their faces full of understanding. "We will always be with you, Alex," my great-grandfather said. "You have done our family a great service. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." With those words, the light around me grew even brighter, enveloping me in its warmth. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose. I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. As the light consumed me, I thought about my family, about the future that lay ahead. I felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. The darkness was gone, and the light was all around me. And then, with a final surge of warmth, I moved on, leaving the world of shadows and whispers behind. I knew that my family was safe, that the curse was broken, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. We've been on lockdown for 3 days, and the teachers are now acting strange. Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but here I am. My name's Josh, and I go to this small high school in a pretty quiet town. It's one of those places where nothing ever happens, until it does. And now, I don't know how to make sense of it. It all started 3 days ago. We were in the middle of 4th period when the principal's voice came over the intercom, sounding more stressed than I'd ever heard him. He told us we were on lockdown, and it wasn't a drill. At first, everyone thought it was a joke or some kind of messed up prank, but the seriousness in his voice made it clear it wasn't. We had to lock the doors, turn off the lights, and hide. My classmates and I did as we were told. Our teacher, Mr. Owens, was trying to stay calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We huddled in a corner of the room, and I could hear the faint sounds of police sirens outside. Minutes turned into hours, and we weren't getting any updates. It was just silence, punctuated by whispers and the occasional nervous laugh. By evening, we were still stuck in the classroom. Our phones had stopped working, and it felt like we were completely cut off from the outside world. The school was eerily quiet, which was strange considering how much chaos there must have been with the lockdown. Eventually, Mr. Owens left the room, saying he was going to find out what was happening. He never came back. We spent that first night in the classroom, and none of us got any sleep. The next morning, other teachers came around, telling us to move to the gymnasium. They were acting off. Their voices were flat, their movements robotic. We followed them because we didn't know what else to do. The gym was set up with cots, and there was a table with food and water. There were no windows in the gym, so we had no idea what time it was. The teachers told us we couldn't leave, that it was for our own safety. They kept repeating that everything was fine, but it was obvious they were lying. We didn't have any choice but to stay put. That's when the strange stuff started happening. The food tasted weird, like it was laced with something. It made us feel groggy and disoriented. Some of the kids started acting strange too, getting into fights over nothing, mumbling to themselves. I tried to stay clear-headed, but it was getting harder. On the second night, I noticed that some kids were missing. I asked one of the teachers, Mrs. Phillips, about it, but she just gave me this blank stare and said they had been taken to a safe place. Her smile was so creepy, like it was painted on her face. I felt a chill run down my spine. By the third day, things were getting really bad. We were all exhausted and terrified. That morning, the teachers made an announcement. We had to stay in the gym at all times. No one was allowed to leave, not even to go to the bathroom. They brought in buckets for us to use. The smell was unbearable, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. I started noticing more strange behavior from the teachers. They would stand in corners, staring at us with those blank expressions, not blinking for minutes at a time. Sometimes they'd whisper to each other in hushed tones, glancing our way. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like some sort of chant. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I had to find out what was going on. I waited until everyone was asleep, then quietly slipped out of my cot and crept towards the door. It was unlocked, which was strange considering how strict they had been about keeping us in. I made my way down the dark hallway, every creak of the floorboards making my heart race. I reached the principal's office and peeked inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The principal and several teachers were gathered around a table, their faces illuminated by candlelight. In the middle of the table was some kind of book, and they were reading from it in unison. I couldn't understand the language, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. I must have made a noise because suddenly they all turned to look at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. The principal's face twisted into a sinister smile, and he said, "You shouldn't be here, Josh." I bolted back to the gym, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep at all that night, just kept an eye on the door, waiting for them to come for me. And that's where I am now, writing this. I don't know what's happening or what they're planning, but I'm scared out of my mind. If anyone out there reads this, please send help. I don't know how much longer we can last in here. The teachers are getting stranger by the hour, and I'm starting to feel like we're part of some twisted experiment. It's now day 4, and things have gone from bad to worse. I'm not sure if it's the lack of sleep or the constant fear, but I'm starting to feel like I'm losing my mind. More kids are missing, and the teachers' behavior is becoming more erratic and unsettling. This morning, they didn't even bother with the pretense of normalcy. Mr. Owens, the same teacher who had left us the first day and never returned, came back. But he wasn't the same. His eyes were glazed over, and his movements were jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He handed out food without saying a word, his lips moving as if reciting something under his breath. The food tasted even worse today, and I saw several kids gagging and refusing to eat. I noticed a pattern in the teachers' behavior. They would disappear for hours at a time, then return, looking even more detached from reality. I overheard snippets of their conversations, mentions of the ritual and the offering. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. After breakfast, they took another group of students away. This time, they didn't even pretend to have a reason. They just pointed at random kids, who followed them out of the gym like they were in a trance. I tried to make eye contact with some of them, to snap them out of it, but it was like they didn't even see me. By afternoon, I was feeling desperate. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't leave without knowing what was happening to the others. I convinced my friend Sarah to come with me. She was one of the few who still seemed to have her wits about her. Together, we waited until the teachers were distracted, then slipped out of the gym. We headed for the science wing, hoping to find something, anything, that could give us answers. The hallways were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides. As we passed by the classrooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We found a small storage room at the end of the hall and slipped inside. Sarah found a stack of old yearbooks and started flipping through them, looking for any clues. I rifled through the teacher's desk, my hands shaking. That's when I found it, a journal belonging to Mr. Owens. The entries were disturbing, to say the least. He wrote about strange meetings with the other teachers, about a power that was promised to them if they followed through with the plan. There were references to an ancient text and rituals that had to be performed. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. Tonight is the final ritual. The students must be prepared. The offering will grant us the power we seek. We must not fail. Just as I finished reading, we heard footsteps approaching. We barely had time to hide before the door creaked open and Mrs. Phillips stepped inside. She stood there for a moment, looking around with those empty eyes before leaving. We waited until we were sure she was gone, then slipped out of the room. We made our way to the principal's office, hoping to find more information. The door was locked, but Sarah managed to pick the lock with a hairpin. Inside, we found more disturbing evidence. There were old books with symbols I didn't recognize, maps with strange markings, and photographs of students, all of us, taken without our knowledge. In the center of the room was a large wooden box. It was locked, but the key was sitting on the desk. I hesitated before opening it, my mind racing with possibilities. Inside, we found more candles, a ceremonial dagger, and a book that looked ancient. The pages were filled with strange symbols and instructions for rituals. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the book. Before we could make sense of what we were seeing, the intercom crackled to life. The principal's voice, cold and detached, filled the room. All students, report to the gymnasium immediately. The final ceremony is about to begin. We froze, the realization hitting us like a punch to the gut. They were planning something tonight, something terrible. We had to warn the others. We rushed back to the gym, but when we got there, it was too late. The teachers were already there, guiding the students into a circle in the middle of the gym. The kids looked like they were in a trance, their eyes vacant. Sarah and I tried to blend in, but it was no use. Mrs. Phillips spotted us and pointed, her face twisting into a sinister grin. "You two, come here," she said, her voice dripping with malice. We had no choice but to obey. We were led to the center of the circle, where the principal stood, holding the ceremonial dagger. "Tonight, we complete the ritual," he said, his voice echoing in the silent gym. "The offering will be made, and we will receive our reward." The teachers began to chant, their voices rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. This was it. This was what they had been planning all along, and we were the offering. Just when I thought all hope was lost, the gym doors burst open. A group of police officers stormed in, their guns drawn. The teachers scattered, their trance broken. The principal tried to run, but he was tackled to the ground. The students, finally snapping out of their daze, began to scream and cry. Sarah and I were pulled away by a police officer who led us outside to safety. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. As we stood outside, watching the chaos unfold, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if the police hadn't arrived in time. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. In the days that followed, we learned the truth. The teachers had been part of a cult, performing ancient rituals to gain power. They had been planning this for months, using the lockdown as a cover to carry out their final ceremony. The police had been tipped off by a former member of the cult who had grown a conscience. The school was closed indefinitely, and the teachers were arrested. The students were sent home, but the memories of those 3 days will haunt us forever. As for me, I'm still trying to make sense of it all. How could something like this happen in our quiet little town? I don't have any answers, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget those 3 days of terror. It's been a week since the police rescued us, and life should be returning to normal, but it's not. The town is still reeling from the shock, and everywhere I go, I see the same haunted look in people's eyes. I've been having nightmares every night, reliving those terrifying days in the school. Sarah and I have been trying to support each other, but it's hard when you're both dealing with the same trauma. The media descended on our town like vultures, and the story was all over the news. Reporters hounded us for interviews, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. The details of the cult's activities were leaked, and the more I learned, the more horrified I became. They had been planning this for years, infiltrating the school and slowly manipulating events to suit their needs. It was like something out of a horror movie, except it was real. The worst part is that not all the teachers were caught. Some of them managed to escape, and the police are still searching for them. That knowledge makes it hard to sleep at night. I keep my windows locked and a baseball bat by my bed, but it doesn't make me feel any safer. The sense of dread is always there. lurking in the back of my mind. Sarah and I have been talking about what we found in the principal's office. The book, the maps, the photographs. It all points to something much bigger than our school. There are other members of the cult out there, and they might still be planning something. The thought makes my skin crawl. We decided to meet up at the local library to do some research. Maybe if we could understand what the cult was trying to do, we could find a way to protect ourselves. The library was almost empty when we got there. Just a few people browsing the shelves. We found a quiet corner and started digging through old newspapers and books on local history. We learned that our town had a dark past. There were stories of disappearances, strange rituals, and unexplained deaths going back over 100 years. It seemed like every few decades something terrible would happen, and then it would be forgotten, until the next time. The cult had been part of this cycle, using the town's history to their advantage. The more we read, the more paranoid I became. It felt like we were being watched, like there were eyes on us from the shadows. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see one of the missing teachers standing there with that empty, lifeless stare. Sarah tried to keep me focused, but I could see the fear in her eyes too. As we were packing up to leave, the librarian approached us. She was an older woman, with a kind face and a soft voice. She told us she'd heard about what happened at the school and wanted to help. She handed us a book, one we hadn't seen on the shelves. It was an old, leather-bound journal with no title. "Be careful," she said, her eyes filled with concern. "This town has secrets, and some of them are better left buried." We thanked her and left, clutching the journal like it was a lifeline. Back at my house, we opened it up and started reading. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Blackwood, who had lived in the town during the late 1800s. He wrote about discovering the cult and their rituals, about how they had tried to recruit him. He had refused and spent the rest of his life trying to stop them. His entries were filled with details about the cult's practices, their beliefs, and their ultimate goal, to summon something called the Old One. The descriptions were vague, but it was clear that this entity was something powerful and malevolent. Blackwood had managed to disrupt their plans several times, but he wrote that he feared they would eventually succeed. The last entry in the journal was dated just a few days before his death. He wrote about a final confrontation with the cult, about a ritual that would open a gateway for the Old One to enter our world. He didn't know if he could stop them, but he was determined to try. Reading those words sent a chill down my spine. It felt like we were picking up where Blackwood left off, trying to stop something that was far beyond our understanding. We knew we couldn't do it alone, so we decided to go to the police with what we had found. Detective Harris was the one in charge of the investigation. He was a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense attitude, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes when we told him about the journal. He took it anyway, promising to look into it. Days passed, and we heard nothing. I started to feel like we were being dismissed, like no one believed us. Then, one night, I got a call from Detective Harris. His voice was tense, and I could hear the urgency in his words. "You need to come to the station," he said. "Now!" Sarah and I rushed over, our minds racing with possibilities. When we arrived, Harris led us into a back room and locked the door behind us. He had the journal open on the table, and his face was pale. "I didn't believe you at first," he admitted, "but I've been doing some digging. There's something going on here, something big, and I think you're right. This isn't over." He showed us a map with several locations marked. "These are places where the cult has been active in the past. I think they're planning another ritual, and soon." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't safe. None of us were. And if the cult succeeded, the consequences could be catastrophic. We left the station with a renewed sense of purpose. We had to stop them, whatever it took. The shadows were closing in, but we couldn't let fear paralyze us. We had to fight back, just like Blackwood had. Our town's future, and maybe more, depended on it. As we walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The streets were dark and empty, but the sense of lurking danger was palpable. I glanced at Sarah, and I knew she felt it too. The battle wasn't over, It was just beginning. Detective Harris's information was a mix of relief and dread. Knowing the cult's locations was a start, but it also meant facing the horrifying reality of what was happening beneath the surface of our quiet town. The next few days were a blur of planning and fear. Sarah and I spent every waking moment going over maps, piecing together Blackwood's notes with the detective's findings. We knew the cult was planning another ritual, but the when and where was still unclear. Harris suggested that we keep a low profile and let the police handle it, but we couldn't sit idly by, especially after everything we'd seen. One evening, while going through Blackwood's journal for the 100th time, Sarah found something we had missed, a passage about an old church on the outskirts of town. It was a place where Blackwood had confronted the cult before, and it seemed like a likely location for the next ritual. The journal mentioned a specific date, which was only 2 days away. We immediately called Detective Harris and filled him in. He promised to have the place watched, but we could hear the strain in his voice. The police were stretched thin, and he couldn't guarantee they'd have the manpower to cover all the possible locations. Sarah and I decided to check it out ourselves. That night, we snuck out and made our way to the old church. It was a crumbling building, abandoned for decades, with ivy climbing up the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows that danced across the ground. We crept around the perimeter, looking for any signs of activity. Inside, the church was even more unsettling. Pews were overturned, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. At the front, where the altar once stood, we found symbols carved into the wood, symbols that matched those in Blackwood's journal. It was clear that this place had been used for rituals before, and it was likely to be used again. As we were about to leave, we heard footsteps echoing through the halls. We quickly hid behind one of the pews, holding our breath. A group of figures, dressed in dark robes, entered the church. They moved with purpose, setting up candles and drawing more symbols on the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized we were witnessing the preparations for the ritual. We stayed hidden, watching as the cultists went about their work. It was a chilling sight, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. Finally, the cultists left, and we made our way back to the entrance, shaken but determined to stop them. The next day, we shared our findings with Detective Harris. He was grim but resolute. He promised to have officers at the church on the night of the ritual, but he also warned us to stay away. "It's too dangerous," he said. "You've done enough. Let us handle it." But Sarah and I knew we had to be there. We had seen too much, and we couldn't let the cult complete their ritual. That night, we armed ourselves with flashlights and whatever weapons we could find, a couple of kitchen knives and a baseball bat, and made our way back to the church. We hid in the shadows, watching as the cultists gathered. There were more of them this time, and their chanting filled the air, growing louder and more intense. I felt a wave of nausea as the ritual began. The candles flickering and casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the police arrived. They burst into the church, shouting orders for everyone to freeze. Chaos erupted as the cultists scattered, but many of them fought back. The scene was a blur of movement and noise, and in the midst of it all, I saw the principal. He was holding the ceremonial dagger, his eyes wild with a mix of fear and determination. I didn't think. I just acted. I rushed towards him, the baseball bat raised. He turned, a twisted smile on his face, and lunged at me. We struggled, the dagger slashing through the air. I felt a searing pain in my arm, but I managed to knock the dagger from his hand. Sarah appeared beside me, grabbing the dagger and holding it to his throat. "It's over," she said, her voice steady, but her hands shaking. "You're not going to hurt anyone else." The principal laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the church. "You think this is over? It's only just begun." Before we could react, he whispered something in a language I didn't understand, and the room seemed to tilt. The candles flared, and a cold wind swept through the church, extinguishing the flames. In the darkness, I heard the cultists chanting again, their voices merging into a single, terrifying wail. Suddenly, there was a blinding light and the chanting stopped. The cultists collapsed to the ground unconscious. The police moved in, arresting the remaining members. The principal was taken away, still laughing, his eyes burning with a feverish light. Sarah and I were taken to the hospital, our injuries treated. We were hailed as heroes, but I didn't feel like one. The principal's words haunted me. It's only just begun. What did he mean? What had we unleashed? In the days that followed, things seemed to return to normal. The school remained closed, and the town tried to move on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of the cult. The journal, the rituals, the talk of the old one. It all pointed to something much bigger than we had anticipated. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a noise outside my window. I got up, peering into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling of dread remained. I knew then that the battle wasn't over. The cult was still out there, and whatever they were planning, we had only delayed it. The shadows were still closing in, and the real fight was yet to come. But this time, I was ready. We were ready. Sarah and I had faced the darkness before, and we would do it again. The town might be safer now, but we would never stop fighting. We owed it to ourselves, and to those who had suffered, to ensure that the cult never succeeded in their twisted plans. As I lay back down, I made a promise to myself. Whatever it took, we would stop them. The shadows might be closing in, but we would be the light that pushed them back. The fight was far from over, but we were ready. The weeks that followed were a tense period of waiting and preparation. Despite the outward calm, a lingering sense of unease pervaded the town. The police continued their investigation, but leads were scarce, and the cult members who had been captured remained tight-lipped. Sarah and I, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was still on the horizon. Detective Harris kept in touch, updating us on any progress. He was a good man, dedicated and determined to see this through. He shared our belief that the cult was far from defeated, and together we started to piece together a plan to find their remaining stronghold. One night, a breakthrough came. Harris received an anonymous tip about an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was supposedly abandoned, but lights had been seen flickering inside at odd hours. The farmhouse was not far from the church where we had disrupted the last ritual. We knew we had to check it out. Harris wanted to send a full team, but he was overruled by his superiors, who were wary of overextending their already thin resources on what might be a false lead. So it was decided. Harris, Sarah, and I would go alone, under the cover of darkness. It was risky, but we couldn't afford to wait. We arrived at the farmhouse just after midnight. It was an eerie sight, dilapidated and shrouded in darkness, with only the faintest glow emanating from within. We parked a distance away and approached on foot, moving silently through the tall grass. The night was still, the air thick with anticipation. Inside, we could hear low voices and the occasional clink of metal. Harris signalled for us to wait as he crept closer, peering through a crack in the wooden boards. He turned back, nodding grimly. "It's them," he whispered. "Looks like they're preparing for another ritual." We slipped inside through a broken window, careful to avoid making any noise. The farmhouse was musty and dark, filled with cobwebs and the remnants of a life long abandoned. We followed the voices to a large room at the back, where a group of cultists were gathered around a makeshift altar. The scene was all too familiar. Candles, symbols, and the ever-present feeling of malevolence. The leader of the group was none other than the principal, now stripped of his formal attire, and dressed in the same dark robes as the others. His eyes burned with a fanatic light, and he spoke in the same strange language we had heard before. This time, there was no hesitation. Harris stepped forward, his gun drawn. "Freeze! Police!" he shouted. The cultists turned in unison, their expressions vacant and unyielding. "Seize them!" the principal hissed, and the cultists moved towards us. What followed was a chaotic blur. Harris fired his weapon, the sound deafening in the confined space. Sarah and I grabbed whatever we could find, broken pieces of wood, old tools, to defend ourselves. The cultists were relentless, attacking with a frenzied intensity. In the midst of the struggle, the principal continued his chant, his voice rising above the noise. The air grew colder, and I felt a palpable force pressing in on us. Desperation fueled our fight, and slowly we began to overpower the cultists. Just as we thought we had the upper hand, the principal raised his hands, and a blinding light filled the room. I felt myself being lifted off my feet, the force of it slamming me against the wall. Pain shot through my body, but I forced myself to stand, focusing on the principal. Sarah, bloodied but determined, made her way to the altar. She grabbed the ceremonial dagger, the same one we had seen before, and hurled it at the principal. The blade struck him in the shoulder, breaking his concentration. The light dimmed, and the oppressive force lifted. Harris took advantage of the moment, tackling the principal to the ground. The remaining cultists, disoriented and leaderless, were quickly subdued. The farmhouse fell silent, the only sound our heavy breathing and the distant wail of approaching sirens. As the police arrived to secure the scene, the principal was dragged away, still muttering curses and threats. "You cannot stop us," he spat. "The old one will rise, and you will all suffer." With the immediate threat neutralized, we searched the farmhouse, uncovering more of the cult's secrets. Old books filled with dark rituals, maps indicating other potential sites, and records of their members. It was clear this was just one part of a larger network. In the days that followed, the farmhouse raid led to the capture of more cult members and the discovery of other locations where rituals had been performed. The police worked tirelessly to dismantle the cult, but the shadow of their influence lingered. Sarah and I returned to our lives, but we were forever changed. The experience had bonded us in ways we couldn't fully explain, and we knew we would always have to look over our shoulders. The threat might have been diminished, but it wasn't gone. The words of the principal echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that still lurked. As I lay in bed each night, I kept a flashlight and a knife within reach, ready for whatever might come next. The fight against the cult was far from over, but we were ready. We had faced the shadows and survived, and we would continue to stand against them, no matter the cost. The town slowly began to heal, but the scars of those dark days remained. We had learned a hard truth, that evil could hide in the most unexpected places, and sometimes it took extraordinary courage to confront it. We were no longer the naive kids who had once thought our biggest worries were exams and high school drama. We were warriors, bound by a shared nightmare, and ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Every night I hear someone crying in my backyard. The neighbours warned me not to listen to it. "Hey everyone, I'm not really sure where to start with this, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar or can offer some advice. I just moved into a new house about a month ago. It's an old Victorian-style place, kind of rundown, but I got it for a steal. The previous owner, an old man, had passed away, and the house had been on the market for a while. I figured I could fix it up, maybe even flip it for a profit. The first week was pretty uneventful, just the usual unpacking and getting settled in. But then, I started noticing some strange things. Every night, around 4 a.m, I'd hear this faint sound coming from the backyard. At first, I thought it was just an animal or something, but as the nights went on, it became clearer. It was the sound of a woman crying. I mentioned it to my neighbours, an elderly couple named the Thompsons. They've lived in the neighbourhood for decades and seemed to know a lot about the house's history. When I brought up the crying, they exchanged a nervous glance. "You've heard her, haven't you?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice low and serious. I nodded, confused. Mrs. Thompson sighed and shook her head. "You need to ignore it," she said. "Whatever you do, don't go outside. Don't try to help her. Just pretend you don't hear anything." I was taken aback. What are you talking about? Why wouldn't I try to help someone who's crying? Mr. Thompson leaned in closer, his eyes darting around as if to make sure no one else was listening. It's not a person, he whispered. We don't know what it is, but everyone who's tried to help, they've disappeared. Just heed our warning and don't listen to her. I laughed it off, thinking they were just trying to scare the new guy. But that night, I couldn't shake their words. Sure enough, at 4 a.m, I heard the crying again. This time, it sounded closer, more desperate. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed and walked to the back door. Through the glass, I could see a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her hair disheveled and her clothes tattered. She was facing away from me, her shoulders shaking with sobs. My heart raced as I fumbled with the lock. I knew what the Thompsons had said, but seeing her out there so vulnerable, I couldn't just ignore her. As I opened the door, a cold breeze hit me, and I stepped outside. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. The woman didn't respond, just kept crying. I took a few steps forward, my breath visible in the chilly night air. "Do you need help?" I asked again, louder this time. The crying stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The woman slowly turned to face me, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Her face was a twisted, grotesque mask of agony. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits, and her mouth was contorted into a scream that I couldn't hear. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and then she started moving towards me, her limbs jerking unnaturally. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose brick and falling to the ground. My heart was pounding, and I scrambled to get up. As I did, I saw her face again, right in front of me, inches away. Her breath was cold, and it smelled of decay. I let out a scream and bolted for the house, slamming the door behind me. I locked the door and collapsed on the floor, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? I sat there until the first light of dawn crept through the windows, too scared to move. When I finally got up, I noticed something chilling. The back door was covered in scratches, deep and jagged, as if something had been trying to claw its way in. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything other than what had happened. I went over to the Thompsons' house, desperate for answers. When they opened the door, they took one look at me and knew. "You went outside, didn't you?" Mr. Thompson said, more a statement than a question. I nodded, too shaken to speak. Mrs. Thompson looked terrified. "Oh dear," she murmured, "it's too late now. Once you've seen her, she won't stop. You're marked." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What is she?" Mr. Thompson sighed. "We don't know. Some say she's the spirit of a woman who was murdered here long ago. Others think she's something much darker. But once you've seen her, she'll come for you. She'll try to lure you out, night after night, until..." "Until what?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Until she gets you," he replied grimly. "And then you'll disappear, just like the others." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This couldn't be happening. I was just an ordinary guy who bought an old house. How had I gotten wrapped up in something so horrifying? I went back home, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. As night fell, I found myself dreading the hours to come. I tried to stay awake, tried to keep myself busy, but as 4 a.m. approached, I could feel my resolve weakening. And then, right on cue, the crying started again, louder this time, more insistent. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The sound seemed to seep into my very bones, and I felt an overwhelming urge to go outside, to see her again. But I resisted. I stayed inside, locked in my room, trembling with fear. The crying went on for what felt like hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and slumped against the wall. This was only the beginning. I knew that now, and I had no idea how to stop it. The next day, I was a wreck. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't concentrate on anything. All I could think about was her, the woman in my backyard. I spent most of the day trying to research the history of the house, hoping to find some clue, some explanation, but the internet offered nothing useful, just vague rumors and urban legends. That evening, I decided to call my friend Mark. He's a bit of a skeptic, always dismissing ghost stories and paranormal stuff as nonsense. I figured he'd either talk some sense into me or, at the very least, keep me company. When he arrived, I could tell he thought I was being ridiculous. "Come on, man, you're really letting this get to you," he said, plopping down on my couch. "It's probably just some prank or a weird animal or something." "I saw her, Mark," I insisted. "It's not just the crying. I saw her face. It was wrong." Mark rolled his eyes but agreed to stay the night, more to humour me than anything else. As midnight approached, we set up camp in the living room, determined to stay awake. We played video games, watched movies, anything to keep our minds off the impending hour. At 4 a.m, right on schedule, the crying began again. This time, Mark heard it too. His skepticism melted away as he realised it was no prank. We both froze, listening to the eerie sound drift through the house. "Okay, that's creepy," Mark admitted, his face pale. "But it doesn't mean it's a ghost or anything. Maybe it's just some crazy person wandering around." "Then let's go see," I suggested, surprising even myself with my boldness. I needed someone else to see her, to validate my fear. Mark reluctantly agreed, and we grabbed flashlights before heading out to the backyard. The night was cold and still, the moon casting long shadows across the grass. The crying grew louder as we approached the tree line, and then we saw her again. She stood just as before, her back to us, shoulders heaving with sobs. "Hey!" Mark called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The crying stopped. She turned to face us and Mark gasped. Her face was the same twisted, horrifying visage I had seen before. He stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. "Oh my God!" he muttered, backing away. "What the hell is that?" I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the house. "Come on, we need to get inside." We ran back, slamming the door behind us. I locked it, just as I had the previous night. Mark was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not possible. That's not human." "I don't know," I replied. My own fear mirrored in his eyes. "But it's real, and it's after me." We stayed up the rest of the night, neither of us able to sleep. As dawn broke, Mark left, promising to do some research and see if he could find anything that might help. I spent the day on edge, jumping at every little noise. That evening, as the sun set, I decided to take more drastic measures. I went to the local library, hoping to find any information about the house or the area that I couldn't find online. The librarian, a kind old woman named Mrs. Green, was more than happy to assist. When I explained what I was looking for, she gave me a knowing look. "Ah, the old Perkins place," she said. "That house has quite the history. Tragic, really." "Tragic how?" I asked, leaning in. Mrs. Green lowered her voice. "Back in the late 1800s, there was a woman named Eliza Perkins who lived there. She was married to a man named Thomas. From what I've read, their marriage was not a happy one. Thomas was a cruel man, prone to fits of rage. One night, Eliza disappeared. Some say she ran away. Others believe Thomas did something terrible to her, but she was never seen again. Since then, people have reported hearing a woman crying near the house, especially at night. Most folks around here think it's her spirit, unable to rest." My blood ran cold as she spoke. "Do you believe it?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mrs. Green smiled sadly. "I've heard the stories all my life. I think there are things in this world we can't fully understand. If Eliza's spirit is still there, she must be in terrible pain." Armed with this new information, I went home, my mind racing. If the crying woman was Eliza, maybe there was a way to help her, to put her spirit to rest. But how? As night fell, I braced myself for another encounter. I knew now that ignoring her wouldn't solve anything. I had to confront her, to try and find a way to end this nightmare. At 4 a.m, the crying began again. This time, instead of fear, I felt a strange determination. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the backyard, my heart pounding. "Eliza!" I called out, hoping to reach her. "If that's you, I want to help. Tell me what you need." The crying stopped, and the air grew deathly still. I could feel her presence, but she didn't appear. I waited, my breath coming in short, anxious gasps. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The crying started again, right in my ear, louder and more desperate than ever. I covered my ears, falling to my knees, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, echoing through my very soul. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Tell me how to help you." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. I was left alone in the dark, shivering with fear and cold. I knew now that I couldn't face this alone. I needed help, someone who understood these things better than I did. As dawn approached, I made a decision. I would find a way to help Eliza, to end her suffering and my own, but I needed to be prepared for whatever horrors lay ahead. After that night, I knew I needed help beyond what Mark or my neighbours could provide. The next morning, I started searching for paranormal investigators or mediums in the area. I found a local group called Spirits of the Past, who specialised in dealing with haunted locations. They had decent reviews and seemed to take their work seriously, so I gave them a call. 2 days later, the team arrived. Sarah, the lead investigator, who was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, James, a tech expert who looked like he walked out of a sci-fi convention, and Lily, a medium who seemed almost too young for this kind of work, but had an air of quiet confidence. As I showed them around the house and explained what had been happening, they listened intently. Sarah asked a lot of questions, while James set up various pieces of equipment, cameras, EMF detectors, audio recorders, around the backyard and inside the house. Lily wandered around, her eyes half closed, as if she was sensing something I couldn't see. When 4 a.m. approached, we all gathered in the living room, the air thick with tension. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes closed, while Sarah and James monitored their equipment. I felt a mix of dread and hope. If anyone could help, it was these guys. Right on cue, the crying began. It was louder than ever, echoing through the house, sending chills down my spine. Sarah motioned for us to stay quiet as she listened intently. James's equipment started beeping and flashing, indicating a strong paranormal presence. Lily's eyes snapped open. "She's here," she whispered. "She's in pain. She's trapped." "What does she want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "She wants justice," Lily replied, her eyes unfocused. "She was wronged, and her spirit can't move on until it's made right." "How do we do that?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. Lily closed her eyes again, focusing. "There's something hidden in the house, something that holds the key to her freedom. We need to find it." The crying grew louder, more desperate. I could feel her presence all around us, like a cold, oppressive weight. We split up, searching the house for anything that might be the key. I went to the basement, which I had barely explored since moving in. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes of junk. I rummaged through the piles, my hands shaking. In the corner, behind a stack of old newspapers, I found a small wooden chest. It was locked, but the lock was rusty and brittle. I pried it open with a crowbar, my heart racing. Inside the chest were old letters, photographs, and a diary. The diary belonged to Eliza Perkins. I flipped through the pages, reading about her life, her hopes, and her fears. It painted a picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare, tormented by her abusive husband, Thomas. The last entry was particularly chilling. June 15th, 1887. "He's coming for me. I can hear him downstairs, pacing, muttering to himself. I know what he plans to do. I can't escape. I can only hope that someday Someone will find this and know the truth. If anyone finds this, please help me. I brought the chest upstairs, my hands trembling. I found this, I said, handing it to Sarah. It's Eliza's diary. It might have the answers we need. Sarah and Lily pored over the contents while James continued monitoring the equipment. The crying had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Lily looked up from the diary, her face pale. "She's been trying to tell us," Lily said softly. "Thomas killed her, and she's been trapped here ever since, reliving her torment. We need to confront his spirit and force him to confess, to acknowledge what he did." "How do we do that?" I asked, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. Lily took a deep breath. "We need to conduct a séance. We have to call his spirit and demand the truth. It's dangerous, but it's the only way to free her." We gathered in the living room, forming a circle around the chest and the diary. Lily lit some candles and began chanting softly, calling out to the spirits. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to deepen. I felt a heavy presence in the room, a darkness that pressed down on my chest. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and I heard a low, guttural growl. A figure appeared in the shadows, a tall, menacing man with a twisted, hateful expression. "Thomas, who dares disturb me?" His voice boomed, filled with anger and malice. "We do," Lily said firmly. "We know what you did to Eliza. We demand that you confess, that you acknowledge your crimes." Thomas's face twisted in rage. "She was mine. She deserved it," he snarled, advancing toward us. I felt a surge of fear, but also anger. "No, she didn't," I shouted. "She was an innocent woman and you murdered her. It's time to face the truth." Thomas lunged at me, but an invisible force stopped him. He screamed in frustration, and then to my shock he began to change. His form flickered, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man he once was before the darkness consumed him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't mean... I was angry." With that, he vanished, and the room was filled with a blinding light. When it faded, I felt a strange sense of peace. The oppressive weight was gone, and the air felt lighter. Lily opened her eyes and smiled. "She's free," she said softly. "Eliza is finally at peace." I felt a wave of relief and gratitude. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I knew my life would never be the same. I had faced the darkness and survived, and I had helped a lost soul find peace. The next few days felt surreal. The crying stopped, the oppressive feeling lifted, and the house felt lighter. The investigators packed up their equipment, and I thanked them profusely. Sarah gave me a reassuring smile and handed me a business card. "If anything else happens, don't hesitate to call us," she said. "But I think you'll be okay now. Eliza's spirit is at rest." Mark came over that evening, skeptical as always, but when I told him what had happened, he just shook his head in disbelief. "I still can't believe you went through all that," he said, "but I'm glad it's over. Maybe now you can finally get some sleep." I laughed, but there was a part of me that was still on edge. I had seen and experienced things that I couldn't explain, and part of me wondered if it was really over. But as the days turned into weeks, the house remained quiet, and I started to relax. Then, one night, about a month later, something happened that shattered my newfound peace. It was around 3 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound was coming from the basement. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way downstairs. The house was eerily silent, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo loudly. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to run back to bed and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but I knew I had to face whatever it was. I opened the door and descended into the basement. The air was cold and musty, and the flashlight's beam cast long, eerie shadows. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The small wooden chest I had found before was open, its contents scattered across the floor. The diary lay open, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. but the basement was completely still. I approached the chest, my heart in my throat. As I reached down to pick up the diary, I heard a faint whisper. I froze, straining to hear. "Help me!" The voice was soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It wasn't Eliza's voice. It was a man's voice filled with fear and desperation. I felt a chill run down my spine. Could it be Thomas? "Help me!" The whisper came again, and I realized it was coming from the wall behind the chest. I moved the chest aside and saw a small, hidden door. It was old and worn, blending in with the wall. I hadn't noticed it before. With trembling hands, I pried the door open. It led to a small, dark crawl space. The smell of decay hit me, and I gagged, covering my mouth and nose. I shone the flashlight into the crawl space and saw something that made my stomach turn. There, in the dirt, was a skeleton. The bones were old and brittle, partially buried. It was a small skeleton, and I realized with horror that it must have belonged to a child. The sight filled me with a sense of dread and sadness. "Help me!" The whisper was louder now, more urgent. I turned and saw a faint figure standing in the shadows. It was a young boy, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Please help me," the boy repeated. "He hurt me. He wouldn't let me leave." I felt a surge of anger and sorrow. This poor child had suffered, and his spirit was trapped, just like Eliza's had been. I knew I had to help him, to put his spirit to rest. "I'll help you," I promised. "I'll make sure you're at peace." The boy's figure flickered, and I felt a rush of cold air. I knew what I had to do. I called the police and told them about the skeleton. They arrived quickly, and I showed them the hidden crawl space. They took the remains away, promising to investigate. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and media attention. The story of the skeleton in the old Victorian house made headlines, and people were eager to know more. The police eventually identified the remains as those of a boy who had gone missing in the late 1800s. His name was William, and he had been Thomas Perkins's son from a previous marriage. The details of his death were unclear, but it was evident that Thomas had been responsible. With the discovery of William's remains, the house felt different. The sense of dread and unease was gone, replaced by a feeling of peace. I knew that both Eliza and William were finally at rest, their spirits freed from the torment they had endured. Mark and the Thompsons were amazed by the whole ordeal. Mark even admitted that maybe there were things beyond our understanding. The Thompsons, who had always known something was wrong with the house, were relieved that the spirits had been put to rest. As for me, I finally felt like I could move on. The house, once a place of nightmares, had become a place of healing and peace. I spent the next few months fixing it up, turning it into a home that honoured the memories of Eliza and William. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a sense of closure. The nightmares were over, and I could finally move forward. But I knew that I would never forget the cries in the night, the chilling encounters, and the journey to uncover the truth. And though I hoped never to experience anything like it again, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the experience. It had taught me about courage, empathy, and the importance of facing the darkness to find the light. Life began to settle into a peaceful routine after the police investigation wrapped up. The house no longer felt haunted, and I could finally sleep through the night without being jolted awake by eerie cries. Mark and the Thompsons checked in on me regularly, and I found solace in their company. Despite the harrowing experiences, I was starting to feel at home. I continued renovating the house, determined to turn it into a welcoming place. The process was therapeutic, a way to cleanse the house of its dark past and give it a fresh start. As I worked, I often thought of Eliza and William, hoping that they had found peace. One evening, a few months later, I was sitting on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the sunset. It was a beautiful, calm night, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. I had just finished painting the last room in the house, and everything was coming together. Suddenly, I heard a soft rustling in the backyard. My heart skipped a beat, and I tensed up, old fears resurfacing. But when I turned around, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I shook my head, chastising myself for being jumpy. As the night wore on, I decided to take one last walk around the property. The moon was bright, casting a silver glow over everything. The air was crisp, and I breathed in deeply, enjoying the tranquility. As I walked along the tree line, I spotted something glinting in the grass. Curious, I bent down to pick it up. It was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. I pried it open and found a tiny, faded photograph inside. It was of a young woman and a boy, Eliza and William. My heart ached as I held the locket, feeling a deep connection to the spirits that had once haunted this place. I decided to bury the locket under the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, where I had first seen Eliza. It felt like the right thing to do, a final gesture of respect and remembrance. As I dug a small hole and placed the locket inside, I whispered a prayer for their peace. When I stood up, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see Eliza's twisted face or William's frightened eyes. Instead, I saw two figures bathed in moonlight, Eliza and William, looking whole and peaceful. Eliza smiled softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. William stood beside her, holding her hand, his face free of fear. "Thank you." Eliza's voice was a soft whisper in the breeze. "We're free now." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. "You're welcome," I said, my voice trembling. "Rest in peace." The figures slowly faded, dissolving into the moonlight. I stood there for a long time, feeling a profound sense of closure. They were truly at peace now, and so was I. Over the next few years, I continued to live in the house, turning it into a place of warmth and light. I often thought of Eliza and William, especially when I was in the backyard by the old oak tree. Their story had become a part of my life, a reminder of the strength of the human spirit and the importance of compassion. The house, once a place of sorrow and fear, had become a sanctuary. Friends and family often visited, remarking on the welcoming atmosphere. And though I never heard the crying again, I always felt a gentle presence, a reminder that love and kindness could heal even the deepest wounds. One spring afternoon, as I was tending to the garden, I found a single white rose blooming near the oak tree. It was beautiful and pure, standing out among the other flowers. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace and joy. I knew in my heart that it was a sign from Eliza and William, a symbol of their newfound peace and the bond we shared. Life moved on, and the house remained a place of happiness and love. The past was no longer a haunting shadow, but a cherished memory of resilience and redemption. And I knew, no matter what the future held, I would always carry the lessons I'd learned with me. The end. I found a way to communicate with the afterlife. I'm now convinced I'm going to be dead tomorrow. I've always been fascinated by the paranormal. Maybe it's because my family has a history of strange occurrences. My grandmother used to tell me stories about our ancestors seeing ghosts and experiencing weird phenomena. I never believed them, not fully, but the stories always stuck with me. A couple of months ago, I found myself in a rut. My job was soul-sucking, my relationship was falling apart, and I needed a distraction. So, I started dabbling in paranormal investigations. It started innocently enough, watching YouTube videos, joining online forums, reading books on ghost hunting. I even bought a few pieces of equipment, an EMF detector, a spirit box, and a digital recorder. One night, while browsing through the darker corners of the internet, I stumbled upon an old, obscure forum. It was full of threads discussing occult practices, seances, and rituals. One thread in particular caught my eye. The title was, "Direct Communication with the Dead, It Works." The post was by someone named Mortis_123, and it detailed a method for communicating directly with the afterlife. The instructions were convoluted, involving candles, specific incantations, and a mirror. I was skeptical but intrigued. I gathered the items needed for the ritual. It took me a few days to find everything. A black candle, a silver mirror, and a specific type of incense. I felt like an idiot setting it all up in my basement, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the instructions to the letter, lighting the candle, burning the incense, and chanting the incantation while staring into the mirror. At first, nothing happened. I was about to give up when the room grew colder. I could see my breath, and the candle flickered violently. Then, I saw something in the mirror. A dark shape, barely discernible. My heart pounded as I leaned closer. The shape morphed into a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes staring back at me. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the candle. I heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I tried to respond, asking who it was, but the face disappeared. The room returned to normal, the temperature rising, the candle burning steadily. I was freaked out, but also exhilarated. I had made contact. Over the next few days, I repeated the ritual, each time growing more comfortable and confident. The whispers became more coherent, and I started to recognize the voices. An old woman, a young child, a middle-aged man. They all seemed lost, confused, asking for help, but they never gave specific details. Then things started to get weird. Objects in my house began to move on their own. I'd find chairs pulled out from the table, pictures tilted on the walls, doors that I knew I had closed left ajar. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was my imagination, but deep down I knew something was wrong. One night, I decided to push the boundaries. I asked the entities direct questions. Who are you? Why are you here? What do you want? The responses were fragmented, but one word kept coming up. Tomorrow. I asked for clarification, but the whispers stopped. The next day, I found scratches on my bedroom door, deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. My heart raced as I examined them, realizing they spelled out a word: leave. Despite the warning, I felt compelled to continue. I needed answers. The following night, I performed the ritual again. This time, the whispers were more insistent, almost frantic. The room grew colder than ever before, and the candle flame turned blue. I saw multiple faces in the mirror, all of them screaming silently. The word tomorrow echoed in my mind, louder and more urgent. That's when I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, until I could no longer understand them. I felt a crushing weight on my chest, as if something was trying to suffocate me. In a panic, I blew out the candle and fled the basement. Since that night, the disturbances have escalated. I hear footsteps following me around the house, disembodied voices whispering my name. I've seen shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, felt cold breezes in closed rooms. The scratches on my door have multiplied, and the word leave is now scrawled all over my walls. I'm terrified. I haven't slept in days. Every time I close my eyes, I see those faces, hear those whispers. I'm convinced that whatever I've contacted isn't just lost, it's malevolent, and it wants something from me. As I write this, the temperature in my room is dropping again. The candle I keep for protection is flickering violently. I can hear whispers growing louder, more urgent. I have a feeling that tonight is going to be different. That word keeps echoing in my mind. Tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm scared. If anyone is reading this, please take my warning seriously. Don't mess with things you don't understand. I thought I was being clever, uncovering some hidden truth, but now I'm convinced I've opened a door that should have remained closed. If I don't post again, you'll know why. I barely slept last night. I kept hearing the whispers, feeling that cold presence in the room. Every time I started to drift off, something would jolt me awake, a loud bang, a whisper in my ear. The sensation of being watched. By morning, I was a wreck. I felt like I was losing my mind. I decided to take a day off work and try to clear my head. I needed to figure out what was happening and how to stop it. I spent the morning researching online, looking for anything that might help. I found countless stories of people who had dabbled in the occult and faced dire consequences, but nothing that seemed to match my situation exactly. Desperate, I went back to the forum where I had found the original ritual. I posted a plea for help, detailing everything that had happened. I hit refresh obsessively, hoping for a quick response. Hours passed, and nothing. I felt more alone than ever. As evening approached, the temperature in my house began to drop again. I could see my breath, and the shadows seemed to deepen. I decided to go to a nearby library that had a section on the paranormal. Maybe, just maybe, I'd find something useful there. The library was quiet, almost eerily so. I felt a chill as I walked through the aisles, searching for anything that might help. I found a few books on hauntings and spirits, but nothing that seemed directly applicable. Then, tucked away in a corner, I found an old, dusty tome titled Communing with the Afterlife, a guide to spirit communication. The book was filled with accounts of people who had successfully communicated with spirits, as well as those who had suffered the consequences. One chapter stood out, Closing the Door. It detailed methods for severing ties with the spirit world and protecting oneself from malevolent entities. I checked out the book and hurried home, hoping I had found a solution. As soon as I walked through the door, I felt a wave of cold wash over me. The whispers started again, more intense than before. I flipped through the book frantically, trying to find the section on closing the door. The instructions were complicated, involving a purification ritual and a protective charm. I gathered the materials as quickly as I could. Salt, sage, a piece of obsidian, and a small vial of holy water that my grandmother had given me years ago. I followed the steps meticulously, creating a circle of salt around me, burning the sage, and reciting the incantations from the book. For a moment it seemed to work. The temperature in the room rose and the whispers faded. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but then, just as I was finishing the ritual, I heard a loud crash from the basement. My heart pounded as I crept down the stairs, clutching the piece of obsidian like a lifeline. The basement was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb overhead. I saw that the mirror I had used for the original ritual was shattered on the floor. The pieces were scattered everywhere, and in the largest shard I saw something that made my blood run cold. Reflected in the glass was a figure standing behind me. It was tall and shadowy, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. I spun around, but there was no one there. I heard the whispers again, louder and more menacing. Tomorrow! I ran back upstairs, slamming the door behind me. I tried calling a friend, anyone who might understand, but no one picked up. I felt more isolated than ever. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, clutching the book and the piece of obsidian. I didn't know what else to do. The night was a blur of terror. I heard footsteps pacing outside my door, the doorknob rattling as if someone or something was trying to get in. The whispers were relentless, growing louder and more insistent. I saw shadows moving under the door, shapes that didn't belong to anything human. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to find the room eerily quiet. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of dread hadn't lifted. I checked my phone, hoping for a message from someone, anyone, but there was nothing. I felt a strange compulsion to check the basement again. I don't know why, but it was like something was pulling me there. I descended the stairs cautiously, my heart racing. The mirror was still shattered, the pieces lying on the floor like a bad omen. As I stood there, I noticed something else. Written on the wall, in what looked like blood, was a single word: tomorrow. It was then that I realized this wasn't just a haunting. Whatever I had contacted wasn't just a spirit, it was something far worse, and it had marked me. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I turned to see the shadowy figure looming over me. It spoke in a voice that echoed in my mind. "You will join us." I ran out of the basement, my mind racing. I knew I had to find a way to stop this, but I was running out of time. Tomorrow was almost here, and I was more convinced than ever that it would be my last day alive. I didn't leave my house all day. I was too scared to face whatever was out there. Every creak, every gust of wind sent me into a panic. I kept the piece of obsidian in my pocket, clutching it like a talisman, but it did little to calm my nerves. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but every show seemed to blur together. I couldn't concentrate. The word tomorrow kept echoing in my mind. I checked the time obsessively, counting down the hours, minutes, and seconds until midnight. Around noon, I got a message on the forum. It was from a user named GhostHunter66. They said they had seen my post and wanted to help. They claimed to be experienced in dealing with malevolent spirits and offered to come over to perform a cleansing ritual. It felt too good to be true, but I was desperate. I gave them my address and waited anxiously for them to arrive. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. I kept hearing faint whispers, but I forced myself to ignore them. My phone buzzed with a message. "I'm here." I ran to the door and opened it to find a tall, imposing man standing on my porch. He introduced himself as Alex and immediately began inspecting my house. He had a bag full of equipment, candles, crystals, a bundle of sage, and other items I didn't recognize. "Your house is saturated with negative energy," he said, setting up for the ritual. "Whatever you've contacted, it's not just a spirit, it's something much darker." He explained that the ritual I had performed had opened a door to another realm, and the entity I had contacted was using that door to gain access to our world. The word tomorrow was a warning. It wasn't just a message, it was a promise. We began the cleansing ritual, lighting candles in every room, burning sage to purify the air. Alex chanted incantations in a language I didn't understand. I followed his instructions, sprinkling salt in the corners and placing crystals on the windowsills. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Then, everything went wrong. The temperature plummeted and the lights flickered. The shadows in the room grew darker, more menacing. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The word tomorrow echoed through the house, as if coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Alex's face went pale. "This isn't right," he muttered. "It's too strong." Suddenly, the candles blew out, plunging us into darkness. I felt a cold, clammy hand grab my arm, pulling me towards the basement. I screamed, struggling to break free, but the grip was unyielding. Alex tried to pull me back, but something invisible yanked him away. I was dragged down the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground. The basement was pitch black, the air thick with malevolence. I could feel the entity's presence surrounding me, suffocating me. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices chanting, "Tomorrow." In the darkness, I saw the shattered mirror. The pieces began to move, rearranging themselves on the floor. They formed a circle around me, trapping me inside. I tried to break free, but it was like hitting an invisible wall. Alex's voice cut through the darkness. He was chanting something, a prayer or an incantation. The pressure around me lessened and I could see a faint light in the distance. The entity's grip loosened and I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Alex rushed to my side, pulling me out of the circle. "We need to finish the ritual," he said urgently. "It's our only chance." We scrambled to relight the candles, the flames flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. Alex continued his incantations, his voice growing stronger with each word. I joined in, repeating the phrases he taught me, willing the entity to leave. The light grew brighter, pushing back the darkness. The whispers faded, replaced by a high-pitched wail. The temperature began to rise, and I could feel the entity's presence weakening. We were winning. But then, just as the light was about to banish the darkness completely, there was a loud crash. The door to the basement slammed shut, trapping us inside. The entity's presence surged, more powerful and angry than before. The candles went out, and the basement was plunged into darkness once again. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and a voice whispered in my ear, "Tomorrow." The last thing I remember is Alex shouting, a blinding flash of light and then darkness. I woke up hours later, lying on the basement floor. Alex was gone, his equipment scattered around me. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The word "tomorrow" was carved into the floor in front of me. I crawled back upstairs, my body aching, my mind numb. I knew what I had to do. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in this house any longer. But as I packed my bags, I realized it wouldn't matter. The entity had marked me. No matter where I went, it would find me. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I felt a growing sense of inevitability. I knew that whatever was coming, I couldn't stop it. I could only wait. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to come to terms with what was happening. I couldn't stop thinking about Alex and what had happened to him. Was he dead? Had the entity taken him? I felt a crushing sense of guilt for dragging him into this, but there was no time to dwell on it. I had to figure out my next move. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the windows. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger as night approached. I knew that this was the final stretch. Whatever was going to happen, it would happen tonight. I decided to document everything in case I didn't make it. I grabbed my phone and started recording a video, explaining everything that had happened. I wanted to leave something behind, some evidence of what I had gone through. Maybe someone else could learn from my mistakes. As I spoke into the camera, I noticed something on the screen. A shadowy figure was standing behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the phone, the figure was gone. My heart pounded in my chest. It was toying with me. I decided to leave the house. Staying here felt like a death sentence. I packed a bag with essentials and headed for the door. As I reached for the doorknob, the temperature dropped again. My breath came out in white puffs. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, stopping me in my tracks. I turned around slowly. The entity was standing there, fully visible for the first time. It was tall and shadowy, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It spoke in a voice that sounded like a chorus of whispers. "You cannot leave." I backed away, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I had to confront it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the piece of obsidian. I held it up like a shield, hoping it would offer some protection. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The entity's grin widened. "You opened the door. Now you must close it." I didn't understand. "How?" The entity pointed to the basement. "The mirror." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had to go back down there. I took a deep breath and steeled myself. This was it. My final chance to end this nightmare. I made my way to the basement, the entity following close behind. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows darker. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the shattered mirror lying in a circle on the floor. I knelt down and began arranging the pieces, trying to fit them together like a puzzle. My hands shook as I worked, the entity's presence looming over me. The whispers were deafening, but I forced myself to concentrate. Finally, I placed the last piece. The mirror was whole again, but the surface was fractured, reflecting my face in a dozen distorted fragments. I looked up at the entity, waiting for it to tell me what to do next. "Use the obsidian," it said. "Close the door." I pressed the piece of obsidian against the mirror. The surface rippled like water, and I felt a surge of energy. The room grew colder, the whispers louder. The entity's eyes glowed with a malevolent light. "Say the incantation," it hissed. I racked my brain, trying to remember the words from the book. I began chanting, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. The mirror's surface continued to ripple, the energy building to a crescendo. Suddenly the mirror shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. I was thrown back, hitting the wall with a thud. The room was filled with a blinding light, and I heard a scream, a mix of my own voice and the entity's. When the light faded, I was alone. The temperature in the room returned to normal. The oppressive presence lifted. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was over. I had closed the door. I stumbled upstairs, my body aching, my mind numb. I collapsed on the couch, my bag forgotten by the door. I closed my eyes, exhaustion taking over. I had survived, or so I thought. When I woke up, it was dark. The house was silent. I reached for my phone to check the time. It was 11:55 p.m. 5 minutes to midnight. 5 minutes to tomorrow. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy, my limbs unresponsive. I heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You cannot escape." The entity's presence flooded the room. more powerful than ever. It was angrier, more malevolent. The ritual hadn't worked. I hadn't closed the door. I had only made it stronger. The clock ticked closer to midnight. I could feel the entity closing in, its cold grip tightening around my soul. The word tomorrow echoed in my mind, louder and more insistent. I realized with a sinking dread that there was no way out. As the clock struck midnight, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. The entity's presence was suffocating, its cold grip tightening around me. I was paralyzed, unable to move or scream. I watched helplessly as the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. The temperature plummeted, and my breath came out in ragged gasps. The word tomorrow echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the doom that awaited me. Suddenly, the room grew silent. The whispers stopped, and the shadows froze in place. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, but it was short-lived. The entity appeared before me, its hollow eyes staring into mine. It spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have opened the door, and now you must pay the price." I tried to speak, to beg for my life, but no words came out. The entity reached out a hand, its fingers like ice, and touched my forehead. I felt a searing pain, as if my very soul was being torn apart. My vision blurred and I felt myself slipping away. In my final moments, I saw flashes of my life, memories of my family, my friends, moments of happiness and sadness. I realized too late that I had taken everything for granted. I had been so obsessed with the paranormal that I had lost sight of what really mattered. As the pain intensified, I felt myself being pulled into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the entity's twisted grin, its hollow eyes filled with malevolent joy. Then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke up, I was no longer in my house. I was in a dark, empty void, surrounded by nothingness. The entity was gone, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy and sluggish. I realized with a sense of dread that I was no longer alive. I was trapped in the afterlife, a prisoner of the entity I had foolishly contacted. The word tomorrow echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of my fate. I don't know how long I've been here. Time has no meaning in this place. The darkness is all-consuming, and the whispers are relentless. I can feel the entity's presence watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I have tried to find a way out, but there is no escape. The void is endless and the entity's grip is unyielding. I am doomed to spend eternity in this hellish limbo, tormented by the very thing I sought to understand. If you are reading this, take my warning seriously. Do not meddle with the unknown. Do not seek to contact the afterlife. The price is too high, and the consequences are too dire. I thought I was clever, but I was a fool, and now I am paying the ultimate price. Tomorrow never came for me. It was always just out of reach, a promise of escape that I could never grasp. I am trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and pain, haunted by the entity I unleashed. Please, learn from my mistakes. Do not follow in my footsteps. Do not let curiosity lead you down a path of no return. The afterlife is not meant to be tampered with, and the door should remain closed. I have made my bed, and now I must lie in it, alone in the darkness, forever haunted by the word that sealed my fate, tomorrow. When I checked into my Airbnb, the owner gave me a horrifying list of rules. Hey everyone, this is my first time posting here, but after what happened, I feel like I need to share this. I recently booked an Airbnb for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a relaxing time away from work and stress. The pictures online showed a cozy little cabin in the woods, perfect for some peace and quiet. But what I experienced was anything but peaceful. The drive there was uneventful, just a long stretch of highway, followed by a winding road through dense forest. The place was pretty secluded, no other houses around, which was exactly what I was looking for. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon, and the golden light filtering through the trees made everything look picture perfect. I parked my car and walked up to the cabin. The owner, Mark, was waiting for me on the porch. He was a tall, lanky guy with a permanent nervous energy about him. His eyes darted around as he spoke, never really meeting mine. He greeted me with a forced smile and handed me the keys, along with a typed-out sheet of paper. "Here are the rules for the house," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Please make sure to follow them exactly." I thought it was a bit weird, but I figured maybe he just had some specific quirks, or maybe previous guests had caused trouble. I took the paper and nodded, not really paying much attention to it at the time. I just wanted to get inside and relax. As soon as I stepped into the cabin, I was hit with a musty smell, like the place hadn't been aired out in ages. It was dimly lit, with heavy curtains covering the windows. The furniture was old and mismatched, giving the place a kind of eerie, forgotten vibe. I shrugged it off, telling myself it added to the charm. I set my bags down and decided to take a look at the list of rules. There were 10 in total, each one stranger than the last. I remember them clearly because they were so bizarre. Do not leave the cabin after 9 p.m. Do not open the windows, no matter what you hear outside. If you hear someone knocking at the door after dark, do not answer it. Keep all the lights on inside the cabin from sunset to sunrise. If you see a figure in the woods, ignore it. Do not use the fireplace. Do not look at your reflection in any mirrors after midnight. If you find a doll inside the cabin, put it outside immediately. Do not take anything from the cabin when you leave. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, do not respond. I laughed out loud after reading them. It felt like some kind of prank. But as I read them again, the gravity of the rules started to sink in. They were too specific and too creepy to be a joke. My unease grew, but I decided to brush it off. I mean, how bad could it be, right? The first night was uneventful. I followed the rules, partly because they were stuck in my head and partly because I didn't want to risk anything. I cooked dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed early. The woods were eerily silent, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. The next day, I spent exploring the nearby trails and taking pictures. It was actually quite beautiful, and I started to relax, forgetting about the strange rules. But as evening approached, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia and tried to enjoy the quiet. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. One of the windows was slightly open. I was sure I hadn't opened it. I closed it quickly, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. Maybe it had been like that when I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. That night, I settled into bed with a book, the list of rules sitting on the nightstand. I had almost drifted off to sleep when I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the clock. It was 11 p.m. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. I lay there, frozen, remembering rule number 3, do not answer the door after dark. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But then I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy, moving back and forth. I pulled the covers up to my chin and lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps eventually faded away, and I managed to fall asleep, though my dreams were filled with dark, shadowy figures and distant, echoing knocks. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted. I decided to shake off the fear and enjoy my day. I had breakfast and went for another hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt different, like they were watching me, waiting for something. I kept hearing rustling noises and seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I found a small handmade doll sitting on the front porch. It was made of sticks and twine, with a head that looked like it was carved from a piece of wood. It hadn't been there when I left. My blood ran cold as I remembered rule number 8. If you find a doll inside the cabin, put it outside immediately. It wasn't inside, but this felt like a warning. I grabbed the doll and threw it as far as I could into the woods, then hurried inside and locked the door. My mind was racing. Was someone messing with me? Or was there something more sinister at play? I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked tight. The sun was setting, and I turned on every light in the cabin, as per rule number 4. As night fell, the sense of dread grew stronger. I couldn't focus on anything. Every little noise made me jump. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something or someone staring back at me. The minutes dragged on, and I started counting down the hours until morning. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again. The knocking. Slow, deliberate, and relentless. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there staring at the ceiling, willing it to stop. But it didn't. It went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I lay there, my body tense, straining to hear any other sounds. And then, I heard a whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was calling my name. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent chills down my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it kept calling over and over. I remembered rule number 10. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, do not respond. I don't know how long I lay there, listening to that voice. Eventually it faded away, and I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, it was dawn, and the cabin was silent. I got up, my body aching from the tension, and decided that I needed to leave. This place wasn't right, and I didn't want to stay another night. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into my bags without caring about organisation. As I was about to leave, I glanced at the list of rules one last time. My eyes were drawn to the final rule. Do not take anything from the cabin when you leave. I hadn't planned to, but the warning felt ominous. I made sure I had all my belongings and nothing else, then headed out the door. Mark was waiting for me on the porch, just as he had been when I arrived. His eyes were still darting around, and he looked even more nervous than before. "Leaving early?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Something came up." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him still standing there, watching me leave. The further I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt, like a weight was being lifted off my shoulders. I don't know what was going on in that place, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I'm never booking an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere ever again. If you ever come across a list of rules like that, my advice is to turn around and leave, no matter how charming the place looks. It's not worth the risk. Hey everyone, thanks for the overwhelming response to my first post. I didn't expect it to blow up like it did. A lot of you asked for updates or more details about what happened, and I wish I could say it ended there. But unfortunately, it didn't. What I thought was the end of a creepy weekend turned out to be just the beginning of something much more disturbing. After I got home, I tried to put the whole experience behind me. I threw myself into work and kept busy, but every now and then, I'd get this nagging feeling, like someone was watching me. I chalked it up to paranoia and tried to ignore it. But weird things started happening around my apartment. It began with small things, like objects being moved or going missing. I'd come home to find my keys in a different spot, or a picture frame turned around. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, but then I started hearing noises at night. Soft whispers, faint knocking, the sound of footsteps when I was alone. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom window open. I know I had closed it before going to bed. I got up to shut it, and that's when I saw it. A small doll, sitting on the windowsill. It was identical to the one I had found at the cabin. My blood ran cold. I grabbed it, and threw it out the window, slamming it shut and locking it tight. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was playing a prank on me. Maybe I was sleepwalking and didn't remember. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The next day, I found another doll on my kitchen table. This time, I didn't touch it. I took a picture and posted it here, hoping someone could give me an explanation. The responses ranged from concerned to outright terrifying. That night, I decided to follow some of the same rules from the cabin. I locked all the doors and windows, turned on every light, and stayed awake until sunrise. It was exhausting, but nothing happened. For a few days, things seemed to settle down, and I started to relax, thinking maybe it was over. But then, a few nights later, it all escalated. I was woken up by the sound of my name being called. It was the same voice I had heard at the cabin, soft, almost gentle, but incredibly chilling. It was coming from outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, paralyzed with fear. The voice kept calling, getting louder and more insistent. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it out. But then, the knocking started. Slow, deliberate, and relentless. I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and slowly crept towards the door. The knocking stopped as soon as I reached it. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. But then I remembered the rules. Do not answer the door after dark. I stepped back and waited, listening. The voice started up again, this time from the living room. It was calling my name, over and over. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I knew I had to leave, but I was too scared to move. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no one outside, and the dolls were gone. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I had experienced. They told me to call if anything else happened and left, leaving me alone with my fear. The next day, I decided to get out of town for a while. I needed to clear my head and figure out what was going on. I packed a bag and headed to my parents' house, a few hours away. I didn't tell them everything, just that I needed a break. They were happy to have me and didn't ask too many questions. For a few days, things were normal. I started to feel like maybe it was all in my head, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me. But then, on the fourth night, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of knocking. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The knocking was coming from the front door this time, and it was louder, more insistent. I crept down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The knocking continued, echoing through the house. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, then looked through the peephole. There was no one there, but the knocking persisted. I backed away, my mind racing. Was I losing it? Had someone followed me here? I called out to my parents, waking them up. They came down, groggy and confused, but the knocking had stopped by then. I tried to explain what was happening, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They told me to go back to bed, that it was probably just a bad dream. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to head back to my apartment. I needed to face whatever this was, figure it out once and for all. My parents were worried, but I reassured them I'd be fine. When I got back to my apartment, I found a note on the floor. It was the same list of rules from the cabin, only this time there was an 11th rule added at the bottom. Return to the cabin. Hey everyone, I'm back with another update. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here we are, after finding that note with the new rule. Return to the cabin. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was calling me back, and I had to find out what. I spent the next few days preparing. I read through all your comments and advice, gathering supplies and making a plan. I packed a bag with essentials, flashlight, batteries, food, water, a first aid kit, and some basic tools. I also brought a camera and a voice recorder, hoping to document anything strange that might happen. I was scared, but I knew I had to go back. The drive to the cabin felt longer this time, more ominous. The weather had turned colder, and dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening rain. As I neared the cabin, the familiar sense of dread settled over me. The place looked the same, but it felt different. Darker, more foreboding. When I arrived, Mark wasn't there to greet me. The cabin stood silent and empty, as if waiting for me. I parked the car and hesitated for a moment before stepping out. The air was thick with an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I took a deep breath and walked up to the cabin. The door was unlocked and I stepped inside. The musty smell hit me again, stronger this time. I set my bag down and pulled out the list of rules. I read through them once more, focusing on the new 11th rule. It was handwritten at the bottom, in the same shaky script as the rest. My hands trembled as I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. I decided to start by searching the cabin for any clues. The place was just as I remembered, dimly lit, with heavy curtains and mismatched furniture. I went through each room methodically, checking for anything unusual. In the living room, I found a hidden compartment under the rug. Inside was an old, dusty journal. I carefully opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The journal belonged to a woman named Eliza, who had lived in the cabin decades ago. Her entries started out normal, detailing everyday life in the woods. But as I read on, they grew darker and more frantic. She wrote about hearing voices at night, seeing figures in the woods, and finding strange dolls around the cabin. The last entry was the most disturbing. She wrote about a list of rules she had to follow to keep them at bay, and how she was failing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the rules had been around long before Mark or I had come to the cabin. I put the journal down and continued searching. In the bedroom, I found a small, locked box hidden under the bed. I used a screwdriver to pry it open, revealing a collection of old photographs. The photos were of different people, all standing in front of the cabin, each holding the same list of rules. Their expressions ranged from uneasy to terrified. One photo stood out. It was of Mark, much younger, holding the list with a look of pure fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin had a dark history, one that had ensnared many before me. I took the photos and journal, hoping they might provide some answers. As the sun began to set, I turned on all the lights in the cabin and settled in for the night. I knew the real test would come after dark. I set up the camera and voice recorder, hoping to capture any evidence of the strange occurrences. The hours dragged by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Around midnight, the knocking started. Slow, deliberate, and relentless, just like before. I forced myself to stay calm, remembering the rules. I didn't answer the door, but I set the camera to record, hoping to capture something. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, then abruptly stopped. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing through the cabin. The voice called my name, soft and insistent. I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to respond. The voice was followed by footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the cabin. I watched in terror as the doorknob to my room slowly turned, but the door didn't open. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 3 a.m. I tried to stay focused, reminding myself that I needed to follow the rules. As the minutes ticked by, the activity intensified. I heard scratching at the windows, disembodied whispers, and the faint sound of a woman crying. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the living room. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously made my way towards the noise. The room was in disarray, furniture overturned, and the curtains ripped. In the center of the chaos was another doll, identical to the ones before. This one had a small piece of paper tied to it. I carefully untied the paper and unfolded it. It was another rule: do not let them in. My heart raced as I realized the gravity of the situation. I quickly threw the doll outside and locked the door. I knew I had to survive until sunrise. The rest of the night was a blur of noises, whispers, and shadows. I kept glancing at the clock, willing time to move faster. Finally, the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The activity stopped as abruptly as it had started. I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted, but relieved. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer, but I also knew I couldn't leave without finding out the truth. I spent the next day going through the journal and photographs, piecing together the dark history of the cabin. It seemed that everyone who stayed here had experienced the same terrifying phenomena, all centered around the mysterious list of rules. The journal hinted at some kind of ancient curse, but the details were vague. I decided to confront Mark. He had to know more about what was happening. I drove into town and found his address, determined to get some answers. When I arrived at his house, he looked surprised to see me, but there was also a glint of fear in his eyes. I demanded to know what was going on, why the cabin had such a disturbing history, and what the rules meant. Mark hesitated, then sighed deeply. He invited me in, and over a cup of coffee, he began to explain. The cabin had been in his family for generations. According to him, it was built on land that was cursed by an old, vengeful spirit. The spirit had set the rules to torment anyone who stayed there, and breaking them had dire consequences. His family had tried to appease the spirit by following the rules and warning others, but it was never enough. Mark had hoped that by renting out the cabin, he could keep the spirit at bay and avoid its wrath. But it seemed the curse was growing stronger, and the rules were evolving. He apologized, saying he never intended for anyone to get hurt. I left his house feeling a mix of anger and fear. I knew I had to do something to break the curse, but I didn't know what. I decided to return to the cabin one last time, armed with the journal and photographs, hoping to find a way to end the nightmare once and for all. Hey everyone, I'm back with another update. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep doing this, but I feel like I owe it to all of you who have been following my story. After my conversation with Mark, I felt a mix of anger and determination. I knew I had to go back to the cabin and find a way to end this once and for all. Armed with the journal, photographs, and a growing sense of dread, I returned to the cabin. The drive felt even longer this time. Dark clouds loomed overhead, and the wind howled through the trees, making the whole scene feel like something out of a horror movie. When I arrived, the cabin looked as foreboding as ever. I parked my car and took a moment to steel myself before stepping out. I entered the cabin, and it felt like the darkness inside was waiting for me. The musty smell was stronger, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I set my bag down and pulled out the journal, flipping to the last few entries. Eliza's desperation was palpable, her words frantic and disjointed. She wrote about a ritual that might break the curse, but the details were vague. I decided to start by gathering all the items mentioned in the journal. Eliza had written about needing certain objects to perform the ritual: candles, salt, a mirror, and something personal from the person performing it. I found the candles and salt in the kitchen, and there were plenty of mirrors in the cabin. For the personal item, I chose the photograph of myself that I had found among the others. As the sun began to set, I set up everything in the living room. I placed the candles in a circle and sprinkled salt around them. The mirror sat in the center, and I placed the photograph next to it. I double-checked everything, my hands shaking. The sun dipped below the horizon, and I turned on all the lights in the cabin, just as the rules instructed. I began the ritual, following the instructions in the journal as best as I could. I lit the candles and stared into the mirror, reciting the words Eliza had written. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist. I felt a presence in the room, something dark and malevolent. As I continued, the cabin creaked and groaned as if it were alive. The temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath in the air. The candle flames flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then, I heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing around the room. The voice called my name, just like before, soft and insistent. I ignored it and kept reciting the ritual. The whispering grew more frantic, and the shadows in the room seemed to close in around me. The mirror fogged up, and I saw a figure appear in the reflection. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and her face twisted in anguish. I realized it was Eliza. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear her words. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse and writhe, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps circling me. I turned back to the mirror and saw Eliza's reflection reaching out, her fingers pressing against the glass. I knew I had to keep going. I finished the ritual, reciting the final words with as much conviction as I could muster. The room grew deathly silent, and for a moment I thought it had worked, but then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The knocking started again, louder and more insistent than ever. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but I stood my ground. The voice called my name, and I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I turned on my flashlight and swept it around the room, but saw nothing. Then I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I looked down and saw a deep scratch running across my skin, blood seeping through my shirt. The room seemed to close in on me, and the shadows grew darker, more oppressive. I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. As I ran, I heard the voice calling my name, louder and more desperate. The knocking followed me, echoing through the cabin. I reached the door and threw it open, stumbling outside into the cold night air. I ran to my car and jumped in, slamming the door behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of there, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin receding into the darkness. The sense of dread began to lift, but I knew it wasn't over. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted and shaken. I checked the scratch on my chest. It was deep, but not life-threatening. I cleaned it up and bandaged it, my mind racing. The ritual hadn't worked, but I had survived. I decided to reach out to Mark again, hoping he might have more information. When I called him, his voice was filled with a mix of fear and relief. He told me that the ritual was only part of the solution. The curse had to be confronted head-on, and the spirit had to be appeased. Mark told me about a hidden room in the cabin, one that Eliza had used to perform the final part of the ritual. It was behind the fireplace, a small space that was used to store items needed for the appeasement. He gave me directions on how to access it and warned me that the final confrontation would be dangerous. I knew I had no choice. I had to go back to the cabin one last time, find the hidden room, and finish the ritual. My life, and possibly the lives of others, depended on it. The thought of returning filled me with dread, but I steeled myself for what was to come. With renewed determination, I packed my bag once more and prepared for the final confrontation. I knew that the next time I stepped into that cabin, it would be the last. One way or another, I was going to end this curse. Hey everyone, this will be my final update. After talking to Mark and learning about the hidden room, I knew I had no choice but to return to the cabin. Armed with this new information and a renewed sense of determination, I set off, hoping to end this nightmare once and for all. The drive back was a blur. The ominous weather from before had given way to a full-blown storm, with rain lashing against my windshield and lightning illuminating the dark forest. When I arrived at the cabin, it looked more sinister than ever, shrouded in darkness and rain. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, bracing myself against the wind. I grabbed my bag and hurried to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. As soon as I stepped inside, I was hit with the familiar musty smell and the oppressive silence. I didn't waste any time. I went straight to the fireplace and began looking for the hidden entrance. Mark had told me it was behind a loose brick on the right side. My hands shook as I felt around, and finally I found it. The brick came loose, revealing a small lever. I pulled it, and the back of the fireplace swung open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I steeled myself and descended the stairs, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder, and the sense of dread intensified. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a small, dimly lit room. It was filled with old, dusty objects, candles, jars of strange herbs, and ancient books. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, identical to the one I had used in the ritual. Next to it was a small altar, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. I knew this was the place where Eliza had tried to perform the final part of the ritual. I set up the candles and arranged the items as best as I could. Following the instructions in the journal, I lit the candles and stared into the mirror, my reflection looking back at me with an expression of fear and determination. I began reciting the ritual again, my voice echoing in the small space. As I spoke, the air grew colder and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. The candles flickered, casting eerie shapes on the walls. I felt a presence in the room, something dark and malevolent. The whispering started again, louder and more insistent than before. The mirror fogged up, and Eliza's reflection appeared once more. Her hollow eyes stared at me, her mouth moving silently. I couldn't hear her words, but I knew she was trying to tell me something. I continued the ritual, my voice growing stronger as I neared the end. Suddenly, the door to the hidden room slammed shut, and the lights went out. I was plunged into darkness, with only the flickering candlelight to see by. The knocking started again, slow and deliberate, echoing through the room. The whispering grew louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps circling me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I nearly screamed. I spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to close in on me, and the knocking grew more frantic. I knew I had to finish the ritual, no matter what. I took a deep breath and recited the final words, my voice steady despite the terror I felt. The room grew deathly silent, and for a moment I thought it had worked. But then the mirror shattered, and a piercing scream filled the air. I fell to the ground, clutching my ears as the sound reverberated through the room. The shadows writhed and twisted, and the air grew impossibly cold. I felt a presence bearing down on me, something ancient and powerful. Through the chaos, I heard Eliza's voice, clear and strong. She was reciting the ritual alongside me, her words blending with mine. The shadows recoiled, and the air grew warmer. I felt the presence weaken, its grip on the room loosening. With one final desperate effort, I shouted the last words of the ritual. The candles flared brightly, and the shadows dissolved into nothingness. The room grew silent, and the oppressive weight lifted from my shoulders. I lay on the ground, gasping for breath, the shattered mirror reflecting the dim candlelight. Eliza's presence faded, but I felt a sense of peace. As if she had finally found rest, the curse had been broken. I gathered my things and stumbled up the stairs, my body weak and trembling. When I stepped out of the cabin, the storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I felt a sense of relief and triumph, knowing I had faced the darkness and won. As I drove away from the cabin for the last time, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent and empty, no longer shrouded in darkness. I knew I would never return, but I also knew I had done the right thing. The curse was broken, and the spirit was at peace. Thank you to everyone who followed my story and offered support. It's been a terrifying journey, but I'm grateful for the experience. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to trust your instincts and never give up, no matter how dark things may seem. Stay safe, everyone.